This is a tragedy that should not have occurred, and I continue to tell my constituents in my district, what if this happened in our town? And how would we want to be treated? And how would we expect to be heard? And I know that very early on, people were not heard. And that is one of our goals, is to make sure that when people bring information, that we just don't look at the science. We talk about folks, and we listen to what people say. It's vitally important. And I hope that out of this we improve the discussion up and down the chain of communities, to our state, to our government in the United States. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. With that, I'd like to call forward LeeAnne Walters. LeeAnne, good morning. Thank you so much for taking time to be here. And the 3-minute comment period was for the public comment. You're good.
Okay. My children started getting sick, and we were having symptoms through the summer of 2014, not realizing that it was our water. My family was diagnosed with scabies 4 times. In November of 2014, my 14-year-old missed a month of school from Thanksgiving to Christmas. We were told that they didn't know what was wrong with him. He had multiple ultrasounds, a colonoscopy, an emergency CAT scan. At one point, we were told they thought he had cancer. They could not figure out where his pains were coming from, the dizziness, the headaches. We were experiencing hair loss. We were experiencing rashes. December of 2014, we had our first bout of brown water. Now, we didn't know what was going on. When we contacted the city, we were told it was due to the winterization that they were doing. By January of 2015, we had received the notice about the TTHMs and that we'd been in violation since May of 2014. And we have a child with a compromised immune system. We contacted his doctor. From his doctor, they said, nope, he cannot drink the water. He needs to be on bottled water. His rashes with a compromised immune system were to the point that when he would come in contact with the water, submerged in a tub, he would get a water line from wherever the water was, waist down, and it would break his skin out so bad that when you would try to put anything on his skin afterwards, he would scream and cry about how bad his skin burned. In this time, we were talking with the city with the TTHM notices. We were going to meetings, and it was very apparent from the very first meeting that they were not being truthful. We were getting half-truths. It was very scripted. They would only answer certain questions. Citizens were asking for a meeting with EPA, MDEQ, and health officials. They winded up moving that meeting. We got that meeting. It winded up getting moved out of City Hall to the Dome, so that nobody would have to be sworn in for anything that was happening. It would fit less people, and there was a strong police force there before that meeting ever started in case things got out of hand. We were not allowed to ask questions. They had to be written down on a piece of paper, and then they would pick and choose from those questions which part of those questions they would ask, and would answer only from what was being asked. Citizens did get rowdy at that point after so long of that, because it wasn't what we'd asked for and it wasn't what we expected. In that meeting, there were many people, not just myself, showing bottles of discolored water, showing vials of hair loss, showing pictures of rashes or showing their rashes. When I spoke with the city of Flint and the emergency manager and Mike Prisby from the MDEQ in that meeting, as we were showing them our water, I was told that I was a liar and I was stupid by showing these bottles of water, saying they did not come from my home, and that I would not get anybody to believe that that was my water. City of Flint started coming in and testing in my home in February of 2015 after the doctor's notes. I finally became a priority. I had been on a list since the beginning of January. As a priority, they started coming in and they started testing. Howard Croft had actually emailed the Genesee County Health Department with my son's doctor's notes in February of 2015 about the rashes. I I did not get a response from the Genesee County Health Department until after May of 2015 about any of it. While the city was coming in and testing my home, they were seeing on a weekly basis that the brown water was something that had become consistent in my home since January, and their test can only run iron up to a 3.3. My iron was always higher than that. They decided to do my first lead and copper test in February. I had no idea what that was going to be at that time. I wasn't, knowledgeable on water things. I was learning, but I got a frantic phone call from the city of Flint, Mike Glasgow to be exact, with a voicemail. In a panic, you could hear the panic in his voice, telling me not to drink the water, not to let my kids drink the water, make sure I wasn't mixing my kids' juice with that water, and that I needed to get a hold of the city because it was the highest number they had ever seen. That test was 104 parts per billion. They decided to do a repeat sample in March, and my second test came back at 397 ppb. On March 19th, 2015, Howard Croft and Scott Kincaid came to my home because they were trying to find my service line. The city of Flint was unable to find my service line. In that conversation that we had, I was told that they were going to pull city ordinances to cover the cost of my service line, and I was told to not pay my water bill. They were going to zero out my water bill because of the high lead that was coming into my home. Behind our backs, though, they were going into block party meetings and telling people that the problem was specific to my home. It was my internal plumbing. When we proved it was not the internal plumbing, they then moved on to that it was my service line, my problem. As this is going forward, we were having issues with our pediatrician in the city of Flint. He was refusing to test my kids for anything. I was told that he'd been in contact with the city. I did not give permission for that. And that I was told by my son's pediatrician that I obviously had an agenda and that they would not test my kids. When we got the lead test back, I immediately called and said, I want my kids tested today. And I was told I had to bring that paperwork in and they would wait to hear from the city before they would test my children. I went to the doctor's office and I told them, you have two choices. You can either give me the lab slips or you can write me a letter telling me why you're waiting to hear from the city to test my children. I later discovered through research that the emergency manager's assistant, Elizabeth Murphy, was my doctor's wife. So we switched pediatricians. We were unable to get the results from the first lead test from my kids. So when I took my son with a compromised immune system to the dermatologist outside of the city of Flint, we went down to Brighton. She decided to run some of the tests that we were not getting answers for here in the city. At that time, I got a frantic phone call, April 2nd, telling me my son had lead poisoning and anemia from the lead poisoning. So at that point, I took it down to Mayor Walling's office. Now, I had spoken to Mayor Walling March 31st at the library when they did the meeting, and I was told he was very aware of my problem, and that they were very concerned about my family, and that if anything should change, to please let him know immediately. And that's what I did. He was gone for Easter. At that point, they sent me up to the legal department. Up at the legal department, I said, why are we here? I'm not here for this. I want to know what you're going to do to protect my family today. I was told I had to fill out a damage claims form in order for us to move forward. I was told I could put $1 million in that damage claim form and they would review my claim. That was never filled out in its entirety. How do you put a price tag on your child's life? From there, they sent me down to Howard Croft's office. He was not there, but Darty Johnson was there. And they came up with the idea that they were going to shut my water off at this point and hook my family up to garden hoses. I was told that that would be for a 4 to 5 day maximum, and that we had to talk to one of the neighbors. The water would be free for both of us because we'd be hooked to garden hoses. And in regards to Mr. Mayor Walling, that I would get a phone call on Monday. Now, apparently that was my fault for not clarifying what Monday, because Monday has never come. I then get told that I have to sign a contract after all of this, a no harm agreement. So it was a standard agreement, and that in order to have the service line replaced, that's how we would do it. And I agreed to sign it, provided that it was a standard agreement. When that was given to me 2 weeks later, still hooked up to garden hoses, it was not a standard agreement. It had my son's lab results, it had all the tests that they had done, it had the contractor's information, and it had the damage claim form. And I was told I had to sign that in order for them to replace the service line. In order for my family to no longer have this coming into my home, it was $1,100. I refused to sign that, so they refused to replace my service line. They refused to move forward with the work that was supposed to get done. We played a game with them for the next 3.5 weeks where I would get a phone call. We're going to come out this week and change your service line. Okay, well, did you sign the contract? No? Well, then we're not coming to replace your service line. At this point, I've been talking with the EPA. Miguel Del Toro is very aware of what was going on at my home, as was MDEQ, because they were emailed from EPA, Jennifer Crooks. Miguel came out to my home during this, and at that point, my family was then diagnosed with a rare staph infection that our dermatologist had never seen before. Now, we can only assume it's from the water at this point because they didn't even know how to treat it at that point. From looking everything up, I started working with Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech because he was the only person I could find that had done anything with lead and water. And EPA and Virginia Tech were taking samples at my home. We were testing in accordance to the LCR, not against it like the City of Flint and the MDEQ. And my results with Virginia Tech, my average was 2,500 parts per billion. My highest test was 13,500 parts per billion. Hazardous waste is 5,000. I then get a visit from my city councilman, Mr. Scott Kincaid, coming out to me telling me I had to sign this contract in order to get the work done. I told him I would only agree to sign the contract if they took out Exhibit 1, which was all the paperwork I described. I was then told that he would hate to see something happen to my children because I was allowing poison to come into my home, and I was not putting my children's interest first by not signing that contract. So I should sign the contract so we could get moving forward. I asked him if he was threatening me with CPS. He said he wasn't. I felt otherwise, and I told him to leave. I then get a phone call from the city telling me that they're going to come out and they're going to actually fix the service line. They canceled again, and it just so happened that Miguel was coming back out to my home to do some additional work. So on the same day that the EPA was there, they were out there to do my service line. When I asked who was paying for the service line on my end, because of our, we had a verbal contract, and then we went to the written contract, I was told to play stupid, to quit asking questions, and it was an anonymous donor, and I didn't need to know. So Miguel was able to get the pipes from the city side and from my home to have those tested. That's when it was discovered that my service line was galvanized iron and the city service line was lead. As we move forward in this, he had put together a report, and in that report he called me to ask me if he could use that information for what was going on in Flint. He had tested 2 other neighbors in my neighborhood that were hooked up to the same service line as me. One came back with minimal lead. One came back with high amounts of lead. While we were going through paperwork and I was researching and figuring out everything with the water, I discovered that there was no corrosion control in the water. When I told this to Miguel, he didn't believe me at first. He wanted to know what I was reading. I told him I was reading the monthly operational reports from the City of Flint. And we went through all the chemicals 2 times verbally on the phone. He asked me to send him the paperwork. I did send him the paperwork. He called me back and said, "Oh my God, they're breaking a federal law. There's no corrosion control in the water." This was in April of 2015. From my understanding moving forward on that, from talks, they had turned around and MDEQ had told them that they were using corrosion control, and then they later recanted that, no, in fact, they were not using corrosion control. We know as the story moved forward that the City of Flint never had the pipes, the equipment to run the corrosion control. That was not installed until late November 2015. Once Miguel's report became public in June of 2015, when he gave it to me, it's different reading your life in black and white and seeing people being hurt than living it every day. I took it to the ACLU and asked them to help me make this public because people had a right to know. When that report went public, Susan Hedman from the EPA apologized to the city, apologized to the state, and Mayor Walling went on TV and assured everybody the water was safe and drank the water. We moved forward to August 4th of 2015. I had found out that we had passed the lead and copper, the 90th percentile test that determines if you're in violation or not for lead and copper. I had asked the city how we had passed because I was assured by the EPA that my results would be used, and I was told that the MDEQ had made the decision not to use my results, and I had to take it up with them. In a meeting with them on August 4th, when I asked them the same question, I was told it was the city of Flint that had made the decision not to use my test results, and I had to take it up with them. When I tried to hand LeeAnne Schechter-Smith from the MDEQ Miguel's report, I was told he had been handled, there would be no final report, and that his report was flawed. And at that point, with everything going on with the EPA and MDEQ, we felt very defeated. If we couldn't get the EPA to stand up and do what the MDEQ and the city of Flint was not doing, who was going to? I called Mark Edwards in tears that day, and I told him I didn't know how we fix this. How do we sit by and let an entire city be poisoned? How do we let all these children be hurt? And that's when the idea came up that we would apply for an emergency grant through the National Science Foundation, and we would conduct a citizen testing on the ground in Flint to prove that this was not just specific to my home or the few select homes that had discolored water. We ran that sample in August of 2015. We were given 300 bottles. We returned 277. 271 were used. We made sure that when we did this test that it was a statistical test. We made sure there was 45 citizens in each zip code that were participating. And we also sat down and had a meeting to figure out how we could safeguard ourselves from being discredited, because we knew the next step in this would be to discredit the citizens like they had been doing all along. My husband had the brilliant idea of making sure that none of the boxes were open except for by the homeowners, and that when they returned them, we would put initials on the seam of the box and tape the box up in front of the homeowner. This way the homeowner and Virginia Tech knew that nobody had touched the samples but the homeowner. That test proved that there was a serious lead problem throughout the entire city of Flint. MDEQ's response to that was to discredit all the work that the citizens in Virginia Tech had done. As this was moving forward, Dr. Mona started looking at the lead levels in children's blood and figured out that there was an increase. Then they actually went after her after that, saying that her work was invalid. At every twist and turn in this, we have been, the citizens, the outcry of us has not been heard. Nobody cared. Nobody city, nobody state. Even at some points, most people EPA. I won't say all because there are very good EPA people working. The only person that tried to help any of the citizens at any point in time, in my opinion, was Mr. Glasgow in the beginning of this, while he was testing at my home, trying to figure out what was going on and not getting support from the rest of the city of Flint or MDEQ. There are emails that prove that. I recently found out that, just yesterday actually, that since we started doing the Virginia Tech sampling 2 weeks ago, that we led again, City of Flint has been going to my home, demanding to test with the people who are living there, because I have family that stays there for the 2 weeks I'm not in the city. And when they told them no, they had to get a hold of me, they then threatened to subpoena to be able to test in my home. And yes, it was the red City of Flint trucks that were at my house. When they were told no again, and to contact me, they came back a third time. Same information was given. Later that night, the person staying in my home found the City of Flint outside at 11:30 at night trying to collect a sample from the outside spigot. When does this stop? When do the citizens get what they need? When are we going to be heard in the manner of which we deserve? The programs that are out there right now to assist people, my family was not offered any services for anything. I have a child who's lead poisoned. I have children that were exposed. We all have health issues at this point. We were offered services late February 2016. My son was diagnosed April of 2015. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Walters, some of the committee members may wish to ask questions. If you would stay just for
Yes.
a couple moments, I appreciate it. And
I have some.
Representative McBroom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Walters. Thank you for your courage through all of this. I mean, I don't know how you persevered in the midst of so much opposition. It's remarkable. I was just hoping for some clarification on a couple of things that you mentioned. You said that the problems that your son especially was having with his skin and his hair, that came before the water itself even looked bad?
We were all getting rashes before the water looked bad. But once the water started coming through the tap in January consistently brown, it got to the point with my son's skin where he was breaking out severely. We had to limit him to a bath once a week, and then we were told we had to give him Benadryl before he could have a bath because of how badly he was breaking out. I have a video that proves what his skin looks like before bath and after in the week in between his weekly bath. It got to the point where we started getting 10 gallons of bottled water a week to boil to bathe him once a week because we could not have any of his clothes, skin, anything with him come in contact with the water.
And so those initial problems that he was having, have they been connected to the TTHMs or to the lead itself? Has there been any connection made to what specifically caused them?
No, all I can tell you is that after the service line was changed, and with him being in Virginia 2 weeks out of the month, he still gets rashes, certain rashes, more of the staph infection rash, but not like it was where his skin was basically peeling off, no.
And then moving on, you mentioned that your first high lead test was in February of 2015, and who reacted? Who responded to that? I mean, the county health department didn't communicate with you after that?
No. There was no communication with them until May of 2015.
How did you end up getting connected with Dr. Edwards?
I looked him up online. After my son was diagnosed with lead poisoning, I had decided with all the stuff going on, we needed to know what was going on with our water because we were not being given truthful answers. I started researching everything water, teaching myself about chemicals, water distribution, all parts of that. After my son was diagnosed with lead poisoning, I went online to look at the health effects, what was happening. I mean, it wasn't just my son. We all were losing our hair. I lost my eyelashes at one point.
So when was it that you first got in touch with Dr. Edwards? Do you
That
remember?
was beginning in April of 2015. I had found him online. I had said something to Miguel at the EPA. I said, hey, I found this professor in Virginia that's done lead and water in children, and I think I'm going to reach out to him. And he said, well, who's doing your independent testing for the EPA to verify your results. He's very aware of your case. So yes, get a hold of him. And me and Mr. Edwards have been working together since April of 2015.
And then you mentioned that in April of 2015, when you contacted Dr. Edwards, you had papers that showed that there was not corrosion controls being added to the water.
Yes.
You had other papers. How did you obtain those papers? Did you pay for a FOIA yourself?
Oh, I wasn't told I had to. Howard Croft handed them over to me, and when I requested them, they were giving them to citizens at that point. All you had to do was ask. Now you have to FOIA them. Now they will not hand you anything. But Howard Croft gave them to me, and then at one point Mike Glasgow gave them to me as well after the request because they gave me part of them because I requested them from the switch forward. So Howard Croft gave me the ones he had, and then they printed them out, and when Mike Glasgow came out to do my weekly testing, he brought out the rest of the ones that they didn't have on hand.
And it's just two last questions. You mentioned that there were some very, very first meetings that you were having before the DEQ came to meetings that you requested, and then those didn't go the way you wanted. I understand that. But that very first couple of meetings that you mentioned, who are those people?
City Council. They were the City Council meetings that they were having to address the issues with the TTHMs for the violation that we were given. And they were doing the special meetings, and then that's where all the first initial contacts were happening.
Okay, and then lastly, when you talk about the city and them showing up to take water sample at your house even recently, you also talk about Mr. Glasgow with the water treatment plant. When you talk about the city, is there a distinction in your mind between folks with the water treatment plant and people with the city, or is that kind of the same?
It depends on what their job title is. Utility director is associated with water to me because that's who I dealt with while we were going forward with the water crisis. So it depends on who you're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Walter, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hanna?
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you for testifying and for all the work you've done for our community, and thank you for your husband too for his service to our country. You gave a tremendous testimony, as you always do. But could you talk a little bit about what it was like, emotionally, physically? I mean, you talked a little bit about the physical things that happened to your family, but I mean, obviously this 2-year ordeal, or close to 2-year ordeal. I mean, what did that do to you? I mean, because I think your case is extreme, but not completely, right? A lot of folks felt this way and had this same situation. What was that? Could you just describe that?
It's been a huge emotional toll on our family for everything that we've been going through. Not being heard, trying to figure out how to help, trying to figure out how to make sure that nobody else. Our thought was when my son was diagnosed, the reason why we refused to sign that contract was because it was not just about my family. It's never been and it never will be. What about all the other families, all the other kids in Flint? How do you sit by and let people be hurt and know about it and do nothing? So the emotions on that, they happen still now. And yes, we have a great support system with, all the wonderful people we've met through this, but when I have 4-year-olds asking me if they're going to die because they're poisoned, and realizing that he's now 5, they just turned 5 last week. I have twins. One's 56 pounds, one's 35. He hasn't grown in a year. He's still having issues with the anemia. And them realizing at 5 years old why there's a difference between them. Yes, it keeps me up at night. Yes, it makes me emotional. These are my kids. These are everybody's kids.
Thank you. I'm sorry to put you through that, but
No, you're fine.
Take him. Senator Yoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Walters, for being here. I have a few questions, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry this has happened to you and your community. Have you heard that from anybody?
My first apology, actually, if you take Miguel de Toro apologized, which he never should have because he was doing his job. And at one point, Mike Glasgow did apologize for not being able to do anything above what he could do, even though he was trying to help. But the first real apology, sincere apology that I got from anybody was January 19th of 2016, and that was Joel Bouvet with the EPA when I went up there to talk to them about the lead and copper rule and to ask them, if it's so great and it works so well, then why is the MDEQ still testing wrong in the middle of a state of emergency? It was already called and they were still testing wrong, and I thought everybody's face was going to fall off in that room because I proved that they were still testing wrong. And that was the first sincere apology that I got. And then in a meeting with Governor Snyder, March 11th of 2016, I was given an apology.
Well, from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry. You were accused of having an agenda, and if your agenda of having clean water for your family and for your neighbors is an agenda, then I thank you for your agenda. Just a couple of further questions, Mr. Chair. You mentioned in your testimony that the Genesee County Health Department essentially had a long response to you from your first initial contact with them. What was the response?
Contact your healthcare provider.
Oh, and you tried that already. And can you elaborate a little further when I think you said it was the DEQ that worked to discredit you. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, everything that we were saying, they said that was not true, that the tests were showing otherwise. When I specifically asked August 4th of 2015, I wanted a justifiable reason for testing with loopholes. Why? Why are you trying to minimize and hide lead? I was never given an answer. To this day, there's not an answer for that. The only thing that they cared about was the fact that they were still in compliance. They had the EPA on their side, so it didn't matter what the people said. We were told, it's only 2 years, get over it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Irwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll add to the thank yous. We all owe you a debt of gratitude. You mentioned in your written testimony, and you actually just mentioned a second ago, the word loopholes. Could you talk to me about what you felt were the loopholes in the testing? And you also, I think just a moment ago, said that it seemed as though these loopholes were engineered to produce a certain result. What do you think that they were trying to accomplish, and what loopholes did you mean?
With the lead and copper rule, there are 3 known loopholes that minimize and hide lead. The biggest one of those would be pre-flushing, where you have people flush the water out the night before, so it washes away a significant amount of the lead. The second loophole would be using the wrong size bottles. And by that I mean the mouth of the bottle. When you're taking a test, it's supposed to be at full force from your tap, like you would drink it, not trickling into the bottle. So it should be the size of a mason jar, the opening of the bottle, and instead, all the bottles that we were being given and all the bottles being used were the size of the opening of a 20 ounce or a 2 liter. So you cannot run it the way you drink it. So when you do the actual test, the lead particulates are not breaking off in the sample that you're going to give. They're going to break off the next time you go up and you open up your tap. And the last loophole is cap on stagnation. Now what that is, with the lead and copper rule, it has to sit for a minimum of 6 hours, your water, and then you draw that water, because the longer the water sits, the more lead that accumulates in it. So to put a cap on how long it can sit, the city of Flint, or MDEQ, the cap was 8 hours. So it had to sit for no less than 6, but no more than 8, or you were disqualified. Now lead will continue to accumulate for up to 72 hours in the water. So to put that cap on there really minimizes, all 3 of those minimize how much lead you're going to find when you test. If you add them all together, you're looking to not find lead. I can tell you from the research that I've done that there are 19 states that test with the same or similar loopholes as Michigan. There are only 10 states that I can verify that test in accordance to the LCR, and there are 21 states that do not make their sheets available, so we have no idea how they're testing.
Thank you. And you know, one of the other limitations, at least as far as I can tell, with the testing regime is that, of course, we don't test for a whole lot of other contaminants. But when you were getting test samples back, were there any other contaminants that were showing up in your results besides, you mentioned the high iron levels? You know, what else were they finding in there that might have been driving some of these health problems?
Well, I had high TTHMs, and I can tell you affirmatively, since July 9th of 2015, I have had 0 chlorine in my water coming into my home. There is no disinfectant. I can verify it from that point forward. When the city was testing in February of 2015, my chlorine levels were at a 0.2, and I was told that was okay. Minimum for chlorine is 0.5.
Thank you. And my last question is, what would you like to see from the state response here in Flint? What should the state be doing differently starting tomorrow?
Complete transparency on how the testing is being done. I had to jump through so many hoops in order to get the information that I got. That should not happen. It should be available to the citizens. It should be available to the public. Public education needs to be done. If people understand why these tests are important, we already proved that they will participate. They just have to understand why they're participating. I want to see them test without the loopholes, using the right bottles, which we've already accomplished. City of Flint MDEQ still has a cap on how long the water can sit for the test. They changed it from 8 hours to 24 hours. Now, I mean, it did make a huge difference with testing, but there's still a cap on it. They did take away the pre-flush finally, and that part of it is great. But even if EPA never gets around to changing the lead and copper rule, it's set up the way it is. The loopholes are not illegal, but they're also not ethical either. So why would we do it? But we did. We need to make sure that people are being protected by these things, not hurt. I would like to see even if EPA doesn't change, how much the exceedance level is. The exceedance level is 15. Anything over 10. Anything over 10 parts per billion should be a huge matter of concern, saying that there is a problem within whatever city is having these tests done. We've already proved that all the levels that were to 5, there was a problem. Look at what the levels are at now after all the damage that's been done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Canfield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. It's an extraordinary story, and it's sad that you had to deal with this. A couple of questions. What tests were you asking the physician to do, if I might ask that?
I was asking to run my son's immunity profile. I was asking to test all of my children for an ANA, a CBC, and the lead and copper test, and a heavy metals test.
Okay, thank you. Are you still living here in Flint? I had heard that you had moved to Virginia.
I am a dual resident. My husband is military. We were transferred. And so we still own our home. We are still citizens here. We still vote here. My family is in Virginia, and me and my children come back every 2 weeks. And I spend 2 weeks on the ground in Flint working on the water crisis, and then I spend 2 weeks in Virginia spending time with my family. And I also, when I'm in Virginia, spend time going up to DC for whatever the people may need, since I'm the closest.
Well, I'd like to point out, having been a veteran myself, that this is very appropriate, and not just veterans serve our nation. You obviously are providing a fantastic service to our nation as a wife of a veteran, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
And as a physician, I don't think any child should be asking their parent, am I going to die, over water in our state. And I am really sorry that those kind of things happened. I'm a father of 4 as well. I can't imagine going through what you've gone through. And thank you for the bravery just to push through this, where many people would just have gone and let it go after the areas. Now, the last question I would like to ask, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, is this. How would you, in the city of Flint, as a citizen, get your water tested today if you wanted to have your water tested? Is there a clear pathway that a citizen can come forth and say, and define who this would go to? This is bad water. It's brown. I don't like the looks of it. I need someone to help me. Is that question been answered for you?
Well, sir, the problem with that is nobody trusts the city or the state anymore. So the tests that are available, people don't trust. After everything that's happened, and they continue to happen with the way things are being done with MDEQ, people don't trust the results. They don't trust the city, they don't trust the state, and they don't trust the EPA. They trust Virginia Tech. Majority of the citizens trust Virginia Tech.
I would concur with your loss of trust. That's something that we're going to have to battle for probably years to try to regain. However, if a citizen were to ask the question, because many citizens don't have your wherewithal. Many people are unable to just pick up the phone and call Dr. Edwards and get the results that you got. Obviously, you're articulate, you're intelligent, and you're a mom on a mission. But I think the question is still valid, and do you feel that there is a pathway to communicating with the state government, the city officials, the local health department? Where would people send their water?
Well, right now, the way they're doing it is if you want to have your water tested, you go to one of the fire stations that is designated as the water distribution centers, and they can pick up a bottle there, follow the instructions, and that goes to the MDEQ. One of the questions I did ask, though, with the information that was just put out by Governor Snyder, was that the round of testing that they were doing, when they said that the water is 90 to 92% is, better, those are still a mix of the smallmouth bottles and the wide mouth bottles. So to put that information out there when it's still not above board or on board, you wonder why there's still distrust within the state. Well, there you have it. You can contact the EPA, you can discuss with them what's going on with your water, and depending on if you fit the criteria or not, they will come in, they will start doing additional testing in your home. And we just did the repeat sample with the same homes that we did with Virginia Tech in August. We've gotten the preliminary results back, but we're waiting for the final findings to say what that shows, to see what the water quality is right now today.
If I might just if I recall correctly, you came down in June and testified down at the Capitol. You were one of the people, I thought I recalled that you were there, and you were very articulate at that time, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I do have a couple questions, if you don't mind, and I guess in your testimony, you spoke about you starting with a group to do testing. When was that, and did you get results from that?
The August testing?
August, yes.
Yep. We got Mark secured the grant with the National Science Foundation under an emergency grant, and he sent us 300 kits, and we distribute those. It took us 3 weeks for distribution and collection, and that's when we got back the 277 kits. 271 of them were valid. By that I mean that we had gotten phone calls from homeowners saying, oh, I didn't realize my child had flushed the toilet in the middle of the night. So, those tests had to be, not part of the study. But from that test, that's when we proved that there were so many homes over the exceedance level.
Thank you. Is your family getting the medical assistance it needs today
We're working on that with the state right now.
with the state?
We have our own medical assistance, but as far as we're paying whatever our co-pays are, anything like that, that's all stuff that we're covering out of pocket.
And who within the state are you dealing with?
There was a reach out to me from DHHS, and so that's the point of contact. I have the information at home. I don't know the name off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. And we had the opportunity to speak just before the committee. You said during your testimony that the Flint Water Department is now come back and asking to test your home in Flint again. What is it you want them to do? I'm just trying to get it on the record for you.
I've always cooperated with the city of Flint. At the beginning of this, I begged on the list with the brown water to get tested, and I was told, yeah, we'll get to you. After the doctor's notes, I became a priority. And then they were coming in and testing, and it was, okay, what the hell's going on here? Excuse the language, but that's what it was. And, it got to a point, Mike Glasgow, lab supervisor, was like, I don't know what else to tell her. This is consistent. I don't know how to help her. And that's when it came up that the service line would be replaced. So I have no problem if they want to come in and test my home. They have my phone number. They have my email. They've had it for over a year. If they want to come into my home and test, all they have to do is call me or email me. I have been nothing but cooperative about getting things done.
And then I guess the more of a statement. Would you please submit to this committee the questions you want answered?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And
yes.
we will ask those questions. We want to thank you for your time today.
Well, hold on. On the record, one of the questions I want answered, why does Michael Prisby still have a job?
Okay.
I already had that written down.
It's on the record and written down.
You can add Steve Bush to that too. I know he's been suspended, but Leanne Schechter-Smith did get terminated, but those were the other two.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Thank you for the travel.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for your husband traveling with you and taking time from his service to be here. We pray for your family, and we're truly sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we'll have come before us Dr. Mona. Dr. Mona, thank you so much. Dr. Mona, if we would, we've been putting committee members or those testifying before us under oath. If you would stand for just 1 second and we administer the oath, and thank you.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury?
Thank you. And thank you for being here again. And please proceed.
Sure. I don't think I could give a better summary than Ms. Walters. Her heroic work and those of the entire city of Flint, I think, is embodied in her testimony. So I think we all pretty much know the story of the Flint water crisis. April 2014, the water switched, and almost immediately there were concerns from the community. The water was brown, it looked gross, it tasted gross, it smelled gross, complaints of skin rashes and hair loss. Moms were at town hall meetings, and pastors and activists, and Dr. Edwards packed his minivan overnight and came up to do testing, and all those fell on deaf ears. And then in late August, I was just at home with a girlfriend who happens to be a water expert. She used to work for the EPA for 8 years in Washington, D.C., when Washington, D.C. had a similar lead and water issue. We were just talking, and she's like, "Hey, Mona, you're up in Flint." I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "You have access to lead records?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "You know, I've been hearing about the possibility of no corrosion control in Flint water." She's like, "That is unheard of. I'm sure you have lead plumbing. You could skip potentially 6 years of what happened in Washington, D.C., where they didn't really know what was going on for that long. If you looked at blood data." I'm like, "Okay." When a pediatrician hears anything about lead, it is a call to action. So I had known and had heard in the media about the concerns about water. We had high bacteria in the water. We had boil advisories. We had 9 months of safe drinking water violations because of the TTHMs, which are disinfectant byproducts. But it was not until late August that I had heard about lead. And you have to act when there's a concern about lead. Lead is not a 9-to-5 job. It is not something you sleep on. When you know the potential consequences of lead, when you know its life course damning potential, you need to know what's going on. So out of pure coincidence, the next day, this was late August, August 27th, I already had a meeting scheduled with the county health department's lead person. And it was about a new grant that the county had received about giving cleaning supplies to people with elevated lead levels. And at the end of the meeting, I asked the person, "You know, I just heard about the possibility of lead in the water. You know, what do you think? You know, you're the lead person at the county health department." And I was told that the county health department has no jurisdiction over water. That's under the control of the public works department. And I kind of scratched my head. I'm like, but this is a public health issue. How can you not have control over the possibility of lead in water? And I was just told it's not under our jurisdiction. So that day, this was August 27th, I emailed the health department, Mark Valachek, Gary Johnson, Jim Henry, kind of the leadership at the health department, including the environmental health supervisors, reiterating my concern about lead in the water. And a few days later was told again, this is not our, this is a concern, but this is not our jurisdiction. And that kind of started my crusade to get data about blood lead levels. Every lead level done in the state goes to both the county health department as well as the state health department. So I was trying to get the data both from our county health department and from the state health department. When I approached our county health department to get the data of blood lead levels, I was told that they had no ability to give those records, that they would have to pull each child's individual lead record at a time. If this is not Public Health 101, I mean, how can you not track and trend children's lead levels? And then in early September, September 8th, I called the nurse, the lead nurse at the state, Karen Lashinsky, and I spoke with her on the phone. I said, have you heard about the possibility of the lead concerns in Flint? Do you have anything to share? And I was told, actually, we did look at the lead levels based on some concerns, and there was a potential spike that we saw. I'm like, can I have that data? And she's like, yeah, I can share that data. No response. I emailed her back the next day. Can you please share the data that you spoke about? I would like to get this data. If you're not the right person I should contact, tell me who I should contact. And I never heard back from that person. Then later on, I contacted the people at the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention to get the data as well. No success at either level, so we decided to do our own research. Hurley Children's Hospital is the only children's hospital around. Our clinic sees the most Medicaid children, most Flint kids in the county. So we decided in early September to pull all the records of our children in our clinic. And what we found was for just the children in our clinic, the percentage of children with elevated lead levels had significantly increased. I couldn't go screaming from the rooftops because the sample size was small. So then kind of working with our research department, we realized that Hurley Medical Center processes most of the labs in the county. So we actually process most of the lead levels in the county. So in a very expedited process, going through all the human protections, research, et cetera, we pulled all the lead levels that were processed through our medical center. And that's when we found the same results, that the percentage of children with elevated lead levels had increased significantly. And when we compared that with Dr. Edwards' work, it directly correlated with where the water lead levels had increased. So the zip codes, and later when we looked at the wards, the zip codes with the highest water lead levels were the same areas where children had the highest increase in their blood lead levels. In late September, September 24th, with the greater kind of medical community at my side, the Genesee County Medical Society, the Greater Flint Health Coalition, United Way, et cetera, we held a press conference at Hurley Medical Center where we shared these findings and had to ethically, professionally, morally alert the public about the potential of lead in the water, about our research findings, about the need to take precautions, especially for pregnant women and young children who might be drinking formula with this water. And then after that, the state attacked us just like they had attacked everybody else. So the continuation of discrediting the citizens and the water experts was the same process when our research was released. After a good week and a half, 2 weeks, I was finally contacted from Dr. Eden Wells from the state, who asked me how I did my research, and then we had a good kind of back and forth about the research, and that kind of prompted them, I think, to relook at their findings. At the same time, excellent reporting from the Detroit Free Press actually showed that the data that they had showed the same increase in children's lead levels. And on October 2nd, the state, at a press conference, admitted that yes, their findings were consistent with my findings, that there is a lead problem. That's it.
Thank you. Senator Hanna.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Monin, for all the work you've done for our community. I have a few questions I want to ask. I know the answer. I think I know the answer to them, but I want to ask you anyway. It's been reported some folks at the state, others, that there are 43 cases of elevated blood lead levels between October and December. And then obviously some people are trying to use those cases as evidence that the lead problem isn't as bad as it is in Flint. Can you tell us why those folks are wrong and talk a little bit about that in detail?
Sure, absolutely. So the detection of lead in a child is very time limited. Lead in your blood has a short half-life, so half of it goes away in about 20 to 30 days, and then you can't detect it in your blood. But once it's in your blood, that damage is done. It is this irreversible neurotoxin. Lead does last in your bones for decades, but in your blood, it only has a short detection period. Our research, which showed this elevated lead levels, was based on lead screening at the ages of 1 and 2. We are mandated by Medicaid to screen children for lead at those ages. And that's because Medicaid serves as a proxy for poverty, and disproportionately low-income children are higher risk for lead exposure. Children in Flint, children in Detroit, et cetera, have higher rates of lead exposure, and that's why we screen for them at the ages of 1 and 2. So lead in water affects a different age than what we screen for. We screen at the ages of 1 and 2 because that's when we worry about household lead exposure. That is when a child developmentally is crawling and walking and has hand-to-mouth behavior and is exposed to lead paint and lead soil and lead dust. And that is why we screen for those ages. However, lead in water affects a different and more developmentally vulnerable age. It affects the unborn, it crosses in utero, and it potentially impacts babies on formula. So imagine a mom, baby wakes up at 3 a.m. and she's making that baby formula, and she gets warm tap water because all babies want warm bottles. Warm water increases the leaching of lead, and she mixes that baby's formula with powdered formula, and that water. For the first 6 months of life exclusively, that baby's getting lead-tainted formula, exclusively when that child's development is most vulnerable. So that child could have had a peak lead level at 1 month or 2 months or 3 months or 4 months of age. And because of that short half-life in the blood of lead, when we screen at the ages of 1 and 2, we are no longer seeing an elevated lead level. That is why my research, the state's number, and all lead levels that are done severely underestimate the exposure because we missed children's peak lead levels. And that is why everybody is being assumed as being potentially exposed. The 43 was from lead testing done after October 1st. October 1st is when we became a declared public health emergency. That is when the public largely knew that there was a problem. So all testing done thereafter really reflects, hopefully, the public's awareness of the problem and not, hopefully, taking precautions and the short half-life of lead. We've been in this lead emergency since April 2014, almost 2 years of lead exposure. And once again, lead levels are very, very misleading because of that short half-life.
Thank you, Dr. Mona. So aside from the short half-life of lead in the blood, what are some of the other gaps in the lead testing in Flint, and what can we do better to make sure, as respect to testing? And let me give you an example. Like, there's a lot of blood testing going on, whether it's through clinics or mass testings. A lot of folks are getting back that they don't have exposure because of the half-life of lead. What are the next steps that should be going on, and do you believe that they are in large enough quantities in our community?
Sure. So all the blood lead testing that's been done and that continues to be done since after October 1st really only reflects that recent or ongoing exposure. And if anybody has a concern about recent or ongoing exposure, they can get tested. However, it is providing false reassurance. So if somebody is getting their child tested right now, it does not tell you what their lead level was a year ago, a year and a half ago, when we potentially had much higher lead levels and were unaware and we're told to relax, drink up, everything's fine. So, we need to kind of move away from the urgency of testing, because once we test, it's too late. We should be testing our water extensively. Everybody should have water testing done. What you're supposed to do with lead exposure in the public health world is something called primary prevention. You are never supposed to expose a population to lead because it is an irreversible neurotoxin. Once we detect it in our children, it is too late. We need to detect it before it gets into the child.
Do you think that there's adequate information given to families, parents, caregivers, so that when they get this sort of false test back or test from this short window, that they, as you mentioned, aren't saying, okay, well, I'm okay now, and just moving on, because that is obviously for the long-term care of these children. Right. If they don't start getting the assessments, whether it's early on or the other programs, right, nutrition, that I know you've talked a lot about, has the state done an adequate job making sure the public has the information?
Right. I think obviously more work can be done. But the state and the federal government is now assuming that every child was potentially exposed. We are not looking at blood lead levels. I think nobody's really looking at blood lead levels. So everybody should be under the assumption that their child was potentially exposed. That does not mean that all these children are going to have problems. Our children are amazing. They are strong and they are smart and they are resilient, and most children will hopefully be fine. And that is a message that we want to convey too, is that this is not a throwaway generation. Our children are going to be fine, but they're going to be even better if we invest in them now, and if we provide them the additional resources, the additional wraparound resources, so that we can mitigate the extent of this exposure. We cannot take away this exposure. I do not have a lead pill or a lead antidote that will take this away, but we can wrap these kids around with everything they need to promote their development. They all need access to nutrition in terms of WIC and breastfeeding support and nutrition availability. Flint has significant challenges with nutrition. They all need access to their medical care provider. They all need developmental testing. They all need early intervention. We need universal preschool. We need early literacy programs. We need so much to give to these children now so that they don't have these consequences. And I speak often about children, but everybody was impacted by this. We have 100,000 people that live in Flint, and if you add up all the people that come here to work or to play, it's about 150,000 people. And lead impacts children and adults and seniors and immunocompromised folks. So all should be afforded the necessary interventions to mitigate the impact of this disaster.
Representative McBroom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor, so much for everything you've been doing for the people here and all of us in the state, really, in bringing this whole crisis to our attention. You know, when you mentioned that the county health departments, they were telling you they didn't have jurisdiction over this issue, and that's certainly something that I think, you know, we need to address at the state in changing that. But I was wondering, just to be clear then, they don't have jurisdiction, but they get the records sent to them?
They receive all children's blood lead levels,
So they get these records, but then they can't do anything about it?
evidently.
Okay. You started looking into this lead problem really in August then,
Yes.
according to your testimony. You had results by the end of September.
Mid-September.
How is it that you were able to react so fast and the state was so slow?
That's a great question. And this was done by myself and one other woman. I had a co-researcher. That's it. But we didn't sleep. This was probably 6 months of research condensed into a 2-week period. Because when you know what lead does, you don't sleep. And you need to get to the bottom of this. So I don't know why people didn't have that same innate curiosity and concern for the welfare of an entire population.
This Karen Lipinski or Lashinsky, who does she work for?
MD HHS.
Okay. And then my last question, just as a physician, I'm hoping you can answer this question for me. Do different children and adults, do they respond differently to the same lead problem? I mean, we heard from Mrs. Walters, she has twins. It seems that one has responded dramatically differently. Does that mean that they were necessarily exposed differently, or could they be exposed the same and still have very, very different responses?
So lead impacts everybody differently. But the smaller people are most vulnerable. So if a child and adult get the same dose, a child absorbs more, and that's when they're most developmentally vulnerable. But it can impact every organ system. But we worry about lead the most because of what it does to your cognition and your behavior. So in large-scale epidemiologic population health studies, it shows this decrease in IQ, in thinking, and a change in behavior. So attention deficit, hyperactivity, impulse control disorders. Lead exposure has also been linked to criminality. It also has an epigenetic impact, which is where your environment impacts your genetics. So mothers exposed to lead, you can see the DNA changes in their grandchildren. So it has these decades-long consequences. And as a nation, lead poisoning, lead exposure has an incredible cost. If you add up decreased lifetime earnings and special education costs and criminal justice costs and medical treatment costs and behavioral health costs, costs our nation about $50 to $100 billion a year, which is entirely preventable, and also for our state. But everybody is impacted differently, and part of the anxiety with lead is you will never know that lead directly caused this. So in 3 to 5 years, a child gets diagnosed with a learning disability, we will never be able to say that was from the lead, or was a child always supposed to have a learning disability. And that is part of that anxiety and that guilt that I see every day in these parents' faces when they come to clinic. They're like, what is going to happen to my child? What will become of them? And we provide a lot of hope and reassurance and things that they can do right now, but there is no way to predict which child is going to have which problem, and that is why we need to do everything for all children.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doctor. I'm going to ask you a couple questions that you might not be able to answer because, as Dr. Canfield knows down at the other end of the table, when you've got that title, sometimes you get asked about specialties and areas that maybe maybe you don't have direct expertise in, but you certainly know more than I do. And you're also here in Flint, so you see the challenges that people are encountering. So these are my questions. You talked just a moment ago about the trauma that parents are feeling and that kids are feeling because it's hard for them to determine how this has affected them, and there's this fear. What's going on with mental health services? Is there access to those types of services here in Genesee County? Are they overloaded because of the unexpected influx of folks who are seeking counseling? And what, if anything, could the state do to fill that hole?
So Genesee Health System, which is our county mental health, has developed a resilience working group, and there's a 24-hour crisis line now, I understand, but I don't know all the details about what's going on. They have also received some additional state funding to increase capacity, and they are working on a long-term plan, both for a short-term for emergency kind of first aid, first responders for mental health issues, as well as a long-term plan to build capacity. If we do not do anything now for these children and these families with lead exposure, we will have huge mental health needs in the future, but we don't know how much we will. So as much as we can invest in mental health, especially pediatric behavioral health, the better. But I do understand they have received some additional resources.
And what about on the nutrition side and also the physical health care side? Are you seeing people having struggle accessing WIC and accessing Medicaid? And could you tell us a little bit about that? And then also, as I'm sure you know and many people in the audience know, certainly all of us know, the state has cut back on food stamps, on SNAP benefits. How are those services being rolled out, and are there choke points here in Genesee County?
Yeah, so I think nutrition is probably the most important thing we can do with this issue. We were hit harder by this issue because of pre-existing poor nutrition. When you have an empty stomach, when your body is low in certain nutrients, you absorb lead more readily. And to combat lead, you need diets high in iron, calcium, and vitamin C during recent and ongoing exposure. But you need great nutrition forever because lead eventually gets stored in your bones. And when you are pregnant in the future or stressed or have poor nutrition in the future, it comes back out of your bones and back into your bloodstream and can cause that neurotoxicity all over again. So we need long-term great nutrition. We have no full-service grocery stores in the city of Flint. None. Very difficult for our families to get healthy food options. So we need expansion of WIC services. We have WIC. WIC is great for pregnant moms and kids up to the age of 5. However, a third of our families who are eligible for WIC aren't even on WIC. We need, I know we've done some work with expanding school nutrition services, but in the short term and the long term, we need significant solutions in the nutrition arena to protect our children now and for decades to come.
You said 1/3 of the families eligible here in Genesee County, or at Flint at least,
Right.
are not receiving
That
those
is my
WIC
understanding.
services.
Yes.
Sounds like there's an opportunity for us to get to work on that.
Right.
And finally, I know this is also out of your area, but one of the things I've heard from a lot of Flint families when I've been reaching out to people here and spending a little bit of time here is about problems with pregnancy, and specifically with problems with miscarriages and stillbirths. I know that's not your area of expertise, but can you tell us anything about that, or maybe where we should look if we're looking for more information about a spike in those impacts?
Sure. So both TTHMs and lead can cause maternal fetal complications. So actually one of the first abortion pills in the 1900s in England was a lead-based abortion pill. Similar research in Washington, D.C., when they had a lead and water crisis, showed significant increases in miscarriage rates. We are doing research right now looking at the maternal fetal complications that could be due to this, both prematurity, low birth weight babies, fetal deaths, congenital malformations that could be from this. So I don't have anything to report right now, but I think the state also has some data, but I don't think they have clinical data like miscarriage rates.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Canfield?
Thank you. I really looked forward to hearing from you, and I appreciate your bravery with what you've done. It's It's an extraordinary thing. And also, I think you're able to do something that a lot of doctors don't ever get a chance to do, and that's impact a population's health. And I really applaud you for that. I'm going to ask you some questions. And my desire, Mr. Chairman, is not to diminish the crisis that's occurring in Flint, but to hopefully help thousands of parents in this city, as you have indicated, have a better understanding of where we stand now and where we've stood in the past. And I know that through your research, you've looked at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services statistics on lead in the state of Michigan. And I would ask you to recall back in 1998, if you've seen these graphs, and I can answer these questions. This isn't a test. I'm not pimping you. But in 1998, do you recall what the number of young Michigan citizens less than the age of 6 that had elevated blood lead levels greater than 5 micrograms per deciliter? It was 44.1%. So almost half of all Michigan children tested had serum lead levels greater than what we test for now. My whole career, I tested for lead levels, and we looked at 10 as our cutoff, 10 micrograms per deciliter. At that time, almost 10%, 9.7% of all children had serum lead levels greater than 10. 1.6% had levels greater than 20. And that compares to, as of 2014, with the newest one that just came out, was 3.5%. And I'm looking at Flint stats, and for last year, do you recall where they're sitting right at the moment? I know there's possibility of some change, but in the city of Flint, we're looking at the percent of children with elevated lead levels is 3.3%. And I know some of your data was a little higher than that, and that's because of spiking. And I know that conceptually we cannot tell how people are going to respond in the short run, but all people in the state of Michigan are tested the same way, are they not? So if we had a percentage in one county, it would be similar to a percentage in any county in our state.
Sure. So that's a great point. In the 1970s, 1980s, people were walking around with much higher lead levels, but we've learned a lot since then, and this is a public health success story. We got lead out of paint, we got lead out of gasoline, and we've learned, and based on the CDC and others, that there is no safe level of lead, and that's why every year, for the last 30 years, the percentage of children with elevated lead levels have been going down and down and down. And even in the city of Flint, those levels had been going down until this water crisis. So we can't tell you, there's no way to know what those children could have been. And many argue that the current economic and social disparities that we have in many of our inner cities were because of these elevated lead levels. We also used to think that, smoking and thalidomide were okay. So we've learned a lot, and now we know there is no safe level. So yes, levels were higher before. It does not make this right. It does not make this preventable tragedy any better that we are now back to levels that we were maybe 10, years ago.
And I want to express exactly the same thing, and I agree with you 100%. But one of the things that we have to wrestle with in the legislature is that we're not just looking at Flint, we're looking at our entire state. And
right, but no other state was poisoned by policy.
So I agree with you 100%. The arrogance and the miscommunication and the inability for scientific interest. As a physician, I'm just struck by it, that people wouldn't say, it's not my problem, but I can show you where the problem can be taken care of. That's what public servants do.
Absolutely.
And that absolutely did not occur. But the other thing that I want to present today is that Branch County in 2012, 10.1% had elevated lead levels. Jackson, 8%. Kent County, 6.2%. My county, up in the thumb of Michigan, Huron County, 5.4%. So there's two things that we need to look at. One of the things is that this is a statewide problem, and we have to help everybody in the state.
I agree.
We do have to help the people of Flint because there was a gross injustice in this community, not just on the health level, but on the economic level and on several other levels. But I'm concerned about folks understanding how this can be mitigated over time. And I'm a little concerned that our Medicaid population is tested quite extensively, but the commercial insured have not been tested. And I guess the point of everything that I'm pointing out here is I'm hoping that you can, as time goes on, help the people of Flint understand, and these mothers and fathers understand, that their children are going to be able to live good lives.
Absolutely.
And I think that we've caused fear in the population here in Flint, and we need people such as yourself and Dr. Edwards to help them understand that the vast majority are going to have
Absolutely.
reasonable lives.
I completely agree. Our kids are going to be even better than they were before. Like I said, they are strong and they are resilient and they're smart. They're going to be okay. But we don't know which ones are going to have consequences. And that's why we need to invest in them now. And I would argue that many other communities do suffer from high lead levels. I practiced in Detroit for 10 years where we had a lead clinic. We used to admit kids for chelation because their levels were so high. So lead it's not a yesterday problem. It is a today problem and it's a tomorrow problem. And unfortunately, both the federal government and the state government hasn't invested in our lead protection programs. So hopefully will call for a renewed investment in those programs because we have learned so much about lead and we need to be doing the primary prevention. But the difference between those communities and our children, like I was alluding to earlier, the only fault of these children were they happened to live in a city that was in financial disarray, but decided to change its water source, that didn't treat it properly, and that was the only fault, that they grew up in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it is not their fault. And in certain areas of our community, we have levels up to 16%. Ward 5, which was hit the hardest, our children's lead levels in our research went from about 4.6% to almost 16% of the kids that were tested had elevated lead levels, and that is at par with any other community in the state. But my message when I meet individually with my patients and whenever I'm speaking is that our kids will be okay. But this is a trauma, like we've alluded to earlier. It's a trauma because of betrayal of every single governmental agency that was supposed to protect them, and because of the unknown of lead.
Thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done. I really appreciate you standing forward and bringing this. And I appreciate your discourse with the people of Flint, because they're not going to believe it from us and me. Even though I consider myself a physician first, I think that message needs to get across, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hanna.
Thank you. Dr. Mona, I just want to talk about that point a little bit more. You mentioned before that now state officials, obviously here locally, federal officials, are determining, and this is sort of agreed upon by all the fronts, this is a population-wide exposure, right? So you mentioned before that blood lead level testing is about 20 days, and so folks that were tested, so they happened to get caught that their lead levels were higher, happened to be caught. So we don't know how many people that went and got their blood tested and maybe got caught in that 25, 26-day exposure and didn't see their lead levels go up, but we're exposed. I mean, most communities don't have lead flowing through their water for 2 years. Am I correct about that?
Correct.
Because I think it's important. I mean, I appreciate the doctor's comments, but to start off saying, I don't mean to minimize it, and then to minimize it in my own community in front of the very doctor who brought this issue forward is not something I'm going to allow to happen. I'm going to say something when someone says that, because this is a problem that my community, our community, is going to have to deal with for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and longer in our educational systems, in our healthcare systems, in our correctional systems, our adults that have compromised immune systems that were, as you said, drinking water that they were told over and over again by folks that their sole job was to protect us, told us the water was safe. I drank it, my wife drank it, my 89-year-old grandmother drank it, my 8-month-old, who I am in the process of adopting, I have no idea whether he drank it, he was exposed to it in utero. I mean, I think it's important to make sure that this never happens again anywhere else, or that the citizens of the state of Michigan are protected, and we should lead the country in setting the standard for lead and copper rule and every other test. But this was something that never should have happened to the people of Flint, and the state, in large part, caused this and has a responsibility to fix it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hune?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for being here. I just had a couple of quick questions. Is there a more intensive test that we can do to people?
Sure, we can do a bone biopsy, but nobody's signing up for a bone biopsy.
Okay.
Not really. We could, we're academically looking at things to assess exposure, so like teeth in the future are good markers. In adults, you can do some sort of imaging, but it's very difficult.
Okay. My other, two more questions, Mr. Chair. Is there a formula that when you receive your test back, that you mentioned the half-life of lead in the body, is there a formula that you should apply to that test to say this was my exposure a month ago?
No, you can't go backwards.
Okay. And one more follow-up, Mr. Chair. The DEQ, when you first came out and released your data, totally discredited you. I remember seeing you on television, because my district's south of here, and I remember the DEQ thrashing on you folks, and I'm sorry for that. When they finally decided to be honest and decided to embrace your data, was there any comments from that department to you, either publicly or to you one-on-one, about the 180-degree switch that they did?
So October 2nd, they had the press conference at Kettering where they did say that their data was consistent with my data. And after the press conference, several of us were in a small room, and I just happened to be standing next to Brad Werfel. And I looked up to him and I said, "You called me an unfortunate researcher and irresponsible and blah, blah, blah." And he put his head down and he said, "I apologize." And Dan Wine at that time did come up to me and personally apologize. But I don't care. I don't care about the apologies. I care about what are we going to do next.
Thank you again for your efforts, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And Representative Broom, you had a follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had one additional question I'd forgotten to ask you, Doctor. You mentioned that you came out with your press conference in September because you had a moral and ethical obligation to do that for the public health. And I guess I'm wondering about some of the counterparts of yours at the state level that you were attempting to work with. Were these people physicians as well? Had they sworn an oath? Did any of them have that? I mean, besides just being decent human beings, I just wondered if any of them had violated their oaths or anything like that.
Not that I know of.
Okay.
You don't have to be a physician to take an oath. This is just innate professional responsibility to do your job.
I agree that there is no excuse for them failing to come forward with it. I just wondered if there was a professional consequence that they could suffer as well.
Not that I know of.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Doctor, I do have a couple questions. Do you feel that there's any sector currently in Flint, any sector of the community that we're still not reaching? Are we missing? You had earlier talked about only a third are being tested that could be eligible, but are we still missing any sectors of the community?
I think talking to some of the community members on the ground may give you a better idea of that. But the reason we were demanding an emergency declaration was because Flint has many difficult-to-reach pockets. We have many homebound people. We have extreme poverty here. We have a 40% poverty rate compared to 15% in the nation. We have significant transportation barriers. We needed the door-to-door efforts, and we need continued door-to-door efforts because we have so many pockets of our population that cannot access the care that they need. Every day in my clinic, about 30 to 40 of my patients who are scheduled for appointments don't come, and it's not because they don't love their children and want what's best for them. It's because they have every obstacle in the world to get to what they need. So we have a lot of work to do.
And that led to my next question, which is, how do we reach the other two-thirds? If we're only reaching a third of those that are eligible for the state services, how do we reach the other two-thirds?
Yeah, so I think this gets back at trust. You need trusted community people to be on the ground and getting people connected to what they need. So they're not going to listen to the state. We need the community to be empowered, and they have been empowered. This is the heroes of the story are the community. They haven't stopped raising their voices since this all happened, and I think the power needs to come back to the city and to the community to do the work that they need to do to rebuild.
You've had the experience and opportunity to work with the Flint Water Interagency Coordinating Committee. How do you feel that that's going?
Yes, so the FWIC, the Flint Water Interagency Committee, has several of the government, the departments of the state, and different experts, and I think it's just beginning. So we're starting our plans, setting goals, both in the short term, medium term, long term. I think if we are able to do everything that we hope to do, I think it will be fantastic for our state. We are trying to build a model public health program, a model water testing program. The outcomes are yet to be seen, but I think it's a great beginning.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Next, we'll invite up Dr. Mark Belichick and Jim Henry from the Health Officers for Genesee. Is Mr. Henry here?
Yeah, he's right there.
All right, thank you. And if you stay standing just for one moment. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here this morning. And Mr. Clerk, would you please administer the oath?
Do you solemnly affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury?
Thank you, gentlemen. And Dr. Belichick, we'll start with you and let you have your opening remarks, and then Mr. Henry, then you, and then we'll go to the committee members for their questions.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm Mark Belichick, the Director of the Genesee County Health Department. As a local health department, we are a small but important part of the public health system in Michigan. My department is a unit of county government with over 50 different programs that we have jurisdiction and authority over. Some are mandated by the Michigan Public Health Code, some are local regulations, some are grant funded, and some are fee-for-service programs, but all are undertaken to help protect the public health of our local community. In Michigan, we no longer have a state Department of Public Health. The programs that were once in the department have been spread across 4 different departments of state government. So the public health system is complex and involves multiple agencies on the local, state, and national level. It is difficult for someone who works in public health to understand all the pieces and explain who does what. The public is even more challenged in trying to understand the system and gets very frustrated when they perceive what they feel is a public health problem. So for public health system to be successful, the various parts must, much like gears turning a wheel, must work together toward common goals of protecting the public health of the people we serve. Assuring that the water we drink is safe is governed by federal regulation, the Safe Drinking Water Act. Michigan has delegated primacy to enforce this law through the Department of Environmental Quality. Regulation of municipal water supplies is not a program for which the local health departments have jurisdiction or expertise. When the citizens of Flint began complaining about the poor quality of their drinking water, many called the local health department. We had to learn quickly about municipal water supplies. We turned to one of our public health state partners, the DEQ, and they assured us that the water met all EPA drinking water standards and was therefore safe. Likewise, when a local physician became concerned that the switch to the river water was increasing blood levels in children, we turned to another public health partner, the Department of Health and Human Services, and they assured us that the change in blood levels was not significant. However, when I asked how the state conducted their analysis and asked if they used Flint addresses in their analysis, which would have resulted in them potentially including a population of residents outside of the city who were drinking Detroit water, it took them almost a week to get me an answer to that simple question. I was not informed until 20 minutes before a press conference when they reanalyzed their data and admitted that it now concurred with the Hurley data. Although the local health department did not have jurisdiction or authority over the municipal water supply in Flint, it was the county that declared the water unsafe to drink because the evidence from independent sources overwhelmingly indicated the water coming out of the taps in Flint was not safe. As this event unfolded, I felt like I was reliving a college lecture about the PBB disaster in Michigan. There was an unprecedented lack of cooperation by the two departments of state government that should have been our strongest partners. Had they been public health partners, we could have prevented this catastrophe. The county declared a public health emergency on October 1st of 2015 because we recognized that it was our responsibility to live up to our mission, which is to improve the quality of life in Genesee County by preventing disease, promoting health, and protecting the public from environmental hazards to health. I did not agree with the governor's characterization of the Flint water crisis as a failure of government on all levels. The county did not fail the city. Indeed, I would argue that at least one unit of state government learned a lesson from the PBB disaster and clearly changed the culture of how they do business. They recognize that they are an important part of a larger public health system that can accomplish a lot more by working together with local public health and the communities that they serve. The Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development could not have been a better partner in responding to this public health emergency for the following reasons. They worked collaboratively with the local health department to protect the public health. They made certain the messaging was developed and issued jointly and reviewed by experts. They recognized that they were not the experts in all things and welcomed input from others. They kept the regulated community and the public informed via coordinated communications. They encouraged transparency and joint communications with appropriate risk messaging. They provided real financial support and boots on the ground to assist local public health in meeting mutual goals to respond as quickly as possible to protect the public health. How do we prevent this from happening again? We need responsible government that is adequately staffed, compensated, and trained with clear lines of authority and oversight, and more open access and transparency to local data and information that is held by the state. We need a Department of Public Health with a public health ombudsman to assure accountability across state departments with public health roles and functions. State public health programs should be accredited just like local public health programs. We need to recognize the limitations of making decisions based upon cost and assure that we incorporate health in all policies and conduct routine health assessments of policy decisions. We need to work together across agencies, levels of governments, and with our communities. We need partnerships with academia and the private sector to improve expertise. We must use technology and improve infrastructure to identify and prevent disasters. The Michigan Care Improvement Registry, MICR, was created in the last century to improve immunization rates here in Michigan. It was jointly developed by local and state public health and healthcare providers. At one time, it took us from the bottom 10 to the top 10 in immunization rates. But much like the rest of our infrastructure, we failed to upgrade and invest in improvements. Wouldn't it be great if we made a commitment to invest in technology that would identify an increase in lead levels or an outbreak of disease as it is happening, and not a year later when the damage is already done and we are investing millions to clean up a mess that never should have happened? I urge you to invest in a public health system that could make Michigan the healthiest state and take us from the bottom and put us back on top. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr.
Henry.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you today. Mark just said a lot. A lot of our experiences that we've been through have been disappointing and challenging. I brought with me a timeline of our activities and events and actions, along with a pack of documents for your review. One of the issues that we encountered was the Safe Drinking Water Act. As Mark mentioned, Legionnaire's disease, or Legionella bacteria, is not a violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The Act itself is developed upon standards. And meeting standards is not the same as protecting the public. I don't think the intention of the law was to allow Legionnaire's disease to proliferate and become a problem, but it does allow for it to happen. I don't think the intent of the law was to allow 10% of the population to be allowed to be poisoned, but the law allows for it. That's a significant issue, and it needs to be addressed. The standards, when you look at the standards and not the public health significance of what is occurring, it allows for these to occur. Even in the first sentence of the legislation, it says to develop standards, which standards aren't enough. From a public health perspective, what we need to do is focus on the public health issues. And we've ran into challenges, and I could go into detail about how we communicated with the state, the DEQ, and they said that Legionnaire's disease or Legionella bacteria is not a violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and therefore they don't have to respond. Or when we FOIA'd the state for water results, when we FOIA'd the DEQ, all of this information is in this packet, and I'll be happy to talk to you more about that. But at this point, I think we just need to move forward. So one other thing, some of the issues that we encountered with lack of cooperation from the state is still occurring. Dr. Mona, you just asked Dr. Mona about a water team. I'm not part of that. I'm the Director of Environmental Health for Genesee County. I should be on there. I was not invited. I was invited to the technical advisory committee that the city put together. It was a good venue for sharing information and transparency and cooperation. It was steps in the right direction. That is no longer enacted. There's no longer a technical advisory committee. I need to be more involved with some of the decisions because we have a direct obligation and responsibility to protect the public of Genesee County. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Anthony?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you to Dr. Henry, and to you, Dr. Henry, first. I'm going to ask you a question, but I don't want you to answer it right away because I have a second question. I think I'd like you to speculate at some point in time why you weren't asked to be a part of that. But the first question I have may help us lead us down that answer because I think it's been great to hear from Dr. Mona and from Leanne, and I think from you guys as well. And I think as we ask these questions, it pretty clearly shows that there needs to be other individuals, and we'll have those folks, I believe, going forward, because a lot of these questions about why, Leanne mentioned it, why people thought, why was the public health of our community not the number one priority? But I'll get to that later. No, the first question I want to talk about, and you focus on a little bit, and the task force that came out last week, the governor's task force that placed primary responsibility and blame on the state and the emergency manager law and DEQ and DHHS, only had 4 paragraphs about Legionella in the whole report, and you talked about that a little bit. So I want to focus on Legionella for a moment. It was reported that back in January of 2015, you were so frustrated by the stonewalling of the city and the state that you had to submit a FOIA request for information. Can you walk us through that process for a minute?
In August of 2014, we noticed an uptick in Legionnaire's disease. At that point, it was sporadic, but there was one hospital system that we focused on that we noticed that there seemed to be hospital-acquired cases, McLaren. And we worked with them immediately when we noticed that there was an uptick in those cases. We started working with the city in September and October of 2014. Initially, the city was open. They wanted to provide us information. And they're the folks that actually do the testing of the distribution system. They know where the problems are. They know where the water moves slowly. They know where the water main breaks are. They know where there's low chlorine residual. And that's just based on common sense. Those are some of the things that we're looking for. But we don't have expertise. This is not our jurisdiction. So communicating with the Department of Environmental Quality, I asked them to assist us with understanding the risks of the municipal water system. And verbatim, Legionella is not a violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we moved forward. We started working with the independent experts, Dr. Janet Stout from Pittsburgh, Dr. Joan Rose from MSU. Mark Edwards was not in the picture yet. Lead was not even on our radar. But we did notice that there was challenges with Legionnaire's disease. The city offered to provide us information, and they didn't, based on those handful of things. I communicated often with Howard Croft, asking for information. It was not provided. We were provided with a stack of documents. This is not the documents, but that's what the documents were, the size. And there was not one relevant document to what we requested. In the FOIA request, which we submitted multiple times because there was no response from the city, this is what we got. The only time that we were able to get the information that we were looking for was when they developed the technical advisory committee. And that committee was useful. We were able to obtain information about chlorine residual and where these risks are in the municipal water system. McLaren Hospital just happened to be in the center of all these issues: slow water, low chlorine, water main breaks. And that's what brought us to the FOIA.
Dr. Henry, did you ever get that FOIA request? Did you ever get responded to? Did you have the information you asked for?
Not completely. No.
And then the next question is, when did the city and state officials stop responding? And do you think that correlate with when you began examining the Flint River as a possible source of Legionella?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. I think one of the reasons why the state was not cooperating is because we were suspecting the Flint River as a source. The cases were sporadic. There were people throughout the Genesee County, but when half of them are within the city, that's enough information that we should be looking into it. And we bring that to the attention of the DEQ, they have jurisdiction over the municipal water system. That's who we need to be part of this. They're still not part of this. Senator Hanna-Attisha, I don't know if I got to the rest of your question. Okay, and I'm not a doctor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Mr. Henry, sorry about that. One more question, two more if I have time. Did you or the health department try to send out any notices to the public or the healthcare providers about Legionella and what happened?
There's a couple things we did. Mark, do you want me to take this question? Okay. One of the things that we did was we work with the infectious disease department from each of the hospitals. That includes Hurley, McLaren, and Genesis. And during those meetings, we meet quarterly, but there's a lot of communications in between. And even in June, we started discussing Legionella. So, and part of that, the infectious disease folks, they're looking at hospital-acquired cases. So the hospital, it's on their radar. They're communicating with their physicians that to basically increase surveillance for Legionnaire's disease. When you see the symptoms, test for Legionnaire's disease. And that's probably part of why we identified many more cases, because of the increased surveillance. But Legionella in general appears to be emerging throughout southeast Michigan. Wayne County had 113 cases in 2013. That alone says something. That's in Wayne County and Metro Detroit. And then we had our situation. But there's still that correlation with the Flint River, the switch to the Flint River, which is undeniable, something that we should be looking at, something we should have been looking at. The other thing that we did was a fact sheet that we shared publicly. In 2014, we developed a fact sheet. We posted it on our website. We shared it with our partners in the community, including the infectious disease folks at the hospitals, just to bring more awareness. Part of the challenge with Legionnaire's disease, it's not the same as, say, for example, foodborne illness or listeriosis or salmonella. It's not as easy as saying, here's a bunch of contaminated food, stay away from it, or we'll seize it or we'll destroy it, and that's part of what we do too. But it's not as easy when you're looking at Legionnaire's disease. There's a lot more challenges.
So there was no communication to providers directly? Was that through the hospitals? Is that what you're saying?
That was through the hospitals.
Okay, and then the last question, and I do think we should, I think as a body, we should request why Mr. Henry is not a part of these conversations. I'd like to have us ask that question. But the last question I have, and then thank you, is in your opinion, were there any similarities between the state's response to the Legionella outbreak and their response to lead exposure in the city of Flint.
I think in both instances, there was poor communication in terms of sharing information and data that they had. And we were challenged because, again, municipal water is not our area of expertise. We work very closely and have successfully in the past worked with the state on outbreak investigations. This community had a syphilis outbreak a number of years ago, and we were very successful in bringing that under control because of the way we worked well together. But in this particular case, we were asking the State Department of Health and Human Services, who's your expert on municipal water? Because we would like to look at this element as a possible source. We don't have an expert in that area. That's the DEQ. And we inform them that we can't get the DEQ to the table. They're your peer agency. Can you bring them to the table? It never happened.
Thank you. Senator Hume?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And it's Mr. Valachek, is that how you pronounce it? Valachek. I guess I have more of a comment, Mr. Chair, and specifically to you, Mr. Valachek. It seems like every time folks, government leaders at all levels, fail the citizens, fail to protect the citizens, they usually come back and beg for more money and more power. That seems like the case. And here we had, before you gentlemen, two previous folks testifying, both commented on your lack of response to them. And then when there was a response, it was an inept response. So please don't act like your hands are clean, Mr. Chairman. And I'm done with my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Irwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you said that after the switch to the Flint River water, there was an uptick in complaints into your office. How many complaints did you get in the years 2013, 2014?
I started at Genesee County Health Department in September of 2014. Historically, the complaints that we received based on conversations with my coworkers, they never occurred. We did not have the same issues. There weren't the brown water events. The taste, the odors, they weren't there. I wasn't here. I can't really answer that question completely, but I can tell you what we experienced after September of 2014, and I think the day I walked in the door, there was a boil water advisory because of E. coli. The river water, we weren't aware that the river water needed different treatment. It seems obvious that it needs a different treatment, but we didn't make the decision, and we were not. We were responding to the complaints.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So is that to say that do you track the complaints you get into your office? When a citizen calls the Genesee County Health Department and says, I have a complaint about my water, does that get recorded in some way where you can answer the question, how many complaints did you get about water in 2013 or 2014?
The complaints that we have jurisdiction, they get logged, and we look into every one of them. In this situation, we received many. In response to the boil water advisories, we sent our staff to the restaurants in that area of the boil water advisory to make sure that they were following the protocols. We worked with the city, but the city, when they publish a boil water advisory, they don't include us. We read about it in the newspaper. So we're getting calls from the community about concerns, and we don't have jurisdiction or authority. The reason why we do get involved is because of the public health risks. And to answer your question, some of those probably didn't get logged.
Okay, thank you, sir. Previous to the committee meeting today, there were some questions asked in writing, and I knew that this question might take some digging and might not have it right at your fingertips, but I was hoping that you might be able to answer it, considering that we informed you of the question before you got here today, which is, you don't track the complaints, but do you track miscarriages, stillbirths, fetal anomalies? Does the health department track that?
That is tracked on the state level.
That's tracked at the state level, and you don't track that at the county. Do you ever look at that data at the county level?
I did request the state do an analysis to see if there was a difference that occurred after the water switch, and they are in the process of evaluating the data.
Okay. Do you get any indication of when that answer is going to come back?
Not a specific date.
Okay. And you do track Legionnaire's disease, is that true?
All communicable diseases, there are over 80 diseases that are required to be tracked and reported by the state public health code. That information goes into the Michigan Disease Surveillance System. It's a computer database run by the State Department of Health and Human Services. We have access only to those cases that are geographically located in Flint, or Genesee County. So we see only cases in Genesee County. If there is a case in Livingston County, we would not see the case.
Right. And so walk me through what happened when you were looking at the data for Legionnaire's cases in Genesee County. When did that data spike, and what action did your office take?
Towards the end of August, we noticed that we were seeing a level greater than we'd seen in the past. And we also identified that some of them seemed to have an association with one of the hospitals here in the community. So we decided to, in fact, I asked Jim to make an appointment to talk to the hospital staff and see if we could identify whether or not there were any problems. Typically, when you're looking for Legionella, you're looking for an association to place. It's not something that's transmitted from person to person. It's not something you can get from drinking the water. So you need to have an environment that is optimal for the growth of the organism and for transmission to occur. So if you recall, the original case of Legionella occurred at a hotel in Philadelphia and was associated with their HVAC system. They had cooling towers on the roof that provided optimal growth. So we took a look to see whether or not that was an issue. And the hospital was very responsive. They hired a consultant. They did hyperchlorination of their system. Once that occurred, we stopped seeing cases associated with that facility until May of the following year.
So at what point in that process did you inform the public?
We had 21 cases at that time. It wasn't that unusual a number. It was nowhere near the 113 that Metro Detroit had the year before. We hadn't identified a specific case in terms of an association with a location and a sample result from a patient. So it was a challenging situation to try and...
Yeah, I think I heard the answer. And so Metro Detroit has 4.5 million people in it. Wayne County has almost 2 million people. How many people are in Genesee County?
just over 400,000.
Okay. My final question is about the CDC. Talk to me about what happened. Did your office attempt to contact the CDC? And if so, what was the response you got, and what was the relationship you had with them around this?
We recognized that the Legionella situation was above our level of expertise, and so we had wanted the CDC brought in to investigate and to work on an investigation with us. When the state found out that we had had discussions with the CDC, they had separate conversation with the CDC, and they informed us that they did not feel our situation warranted calling in the CDC, and we were to work with them on the investigation.
One last question. I've seen a letter that your office sent to the city of Flint indicating that, I believe it was, that the city was switching to the Flint River water, but that your office and the county was sticking with DWSD. Do you recall the letter I'm mentioning? And if so, why did you take it upon yourself to inform the city of that switch on your end?
I'm not familiar with that letter. I believe it came from the Drain Commissioner's office.
All right.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Canfield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, who are you required to report to a Legionella outbreak? What are the reporting bodies that would be responsibility to report to?
We report through the MDSS system to the state. So our reporting is we verify the case, we verify that treatment has occurred, and we look for the potential for connections with the cases.
And you have no responsibility to report to the community on outbreaks?
There's not a specific requirement or a trigger necessarily. If we have a situation where we would have suspected, for example, we were the department that identified the outbreak that occurred in Bill Knapp's. And so we made, once we understood that the connection was related to the commissary in Battle Creek, we made the entire state aware of that.
One more question, Mr. Chairman. The testing at the local hospital, you said they were cooperative and that they chlorinated their system. Were cultures done before chlorination of the system?
Yeah, they did some testing. They hired an environmental consultant. We worked with them in the beginning of September, but they hyperchlorinated on October 4th. And since that time, but prior to that, they had their environmental consultant do some water testing. And I have the report. It's actually in the stack. It does identify Legionella in the water system. There's Legionella in 50% of the larger buildings in any community. So Legionella, finding Legionella in a water system is not uncommon.
All right. So actually, the environment has to be correct or right for it to become a public health problem, then, is what you're saying.
That's correct. There's, the immune compromised are more susceptible. Mm-hmm. The hospitals are a concern of ours. And that's one of the reasons why we started working with the hospital when we noticed that there appeared to be a hospital-acquired cases. Right now, we're identifying all of the larger buildings in the community, in Genesee County in general, but in the city of Flint, there's approximately 15 above 8 stories. And when you get to those higher story buildings, the chlorine residual is less. It dissipates. The water doesn't move as much. And if there's cooling towers on these buildings, then that is also a concern. So we're working with Dr. Janet Stout out of Pittsburgh. We're working with the Center for Disease Control. We're working with Michigan Department of Health and Human Services on a management program for each one of those facilities to address the risks. But that's not, that there's some challenges there too. You know, just because a building's just because there's a large building, even if you find Legionella in the water system, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause illness. So the hospitals are our primary focus, and the hospitals currently are addressing the issue with Legionella in their water system, all three of them.
Are the cooling towers connected to the potable water source, the drinkable water source, or are they an isolated water source? That's my final question, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, well, Legionella has to be inhaled. To answer your question, I'm not sure. I think it's a closed loop system, and I think the water in those systems, they become contaminated at some point because Legionella is very common in the environment. So with the way the cooling towers work is that the cold water, the air is blown through the cooler water to cool the building. And with that comes the aerosolized Legionella so it can be inhaled throughout the ventilation system of the building. To answer your question, I don't know if it's hooked into the municipal water system and it drains out and goes into the wastewater system. I think it's a closed loop.
Most of the cases that I've had experience with, it's actually the condensate between the panels on the coolers is my understanding that gets aerosolized, and that's what causes the Legionnaire's disease. I don't know if that's your understanding or not, but that is my understanding. It's not in the water system itself, but I thank you for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative McBroom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, looking at some of the emails and stuff, Mr. Henry, you talk about how, you know, the CDC in communication with the state decided that there was communication, I believe, here regarding the Legionella, saying the last case was in March. You wrote back and said that you don't know that there's not consensus over this, and then there were more cases after May. What was the response to that email? I mean, when you sent that, I mean, was there any response from anybody?
The Center for Disease Control responded. Laurel Garrison, she's a division director at the Center for Disease Control over epidemiology, and she mentioned in her response that she's concerned about the hospital. And we planned a conference call. At that point, when we were at that point, the Center for Disease Control was working on assembling a team to help us isolate the clinical specimen, the bacteria from the patient, and try to identify an environmental source. So the way that they look at this is once you have a clinical isolate, now you can start comparing it. And before we could have the conference call, the Department of Health and Human Services determined that any further communications between the Center for Disease Control and Genesee County Health Department would have to be in the form of an EPI-8 request from the state epidemiologist. I did not think that the Center for Disease Control was going to go along with this. We received the email on June 8th. So the determination that the outbreak was over was on June 4th. I responded on June 5th and I said, there's no consensus. I think we need to keep looking into this. And by the way, we had 3 new cases between just before June 4th. And and in June, before that time. And at that point, we started working more closely with the independent experts. Janet Stout, we asked that McLaren contact her, she's in Pittsburgh, to help them with what appears to be their hospital-acquired situation. And she did. And she came here with her team. They did some water sampling. They identified Legionella, where it was located, and they mitigated it. And there hasn't been a hospital-acquired case at McLaren since. They're using a product called monochloramine instead of hyperchlorinating the system periodically, which it works temporarily. And the reason why when McLaren hyperchlorinated in October of 2014, we didn't see another hospital-acquired case until May is because of the winter months. And we typically don't see Legionnaire's disease in the winter months because it's colder. So they hyperchlorinated October 4th, and we didn't see a case until May. And then we started seeing quite a bit of cases. So we responded by working with the independent consultants, trying to mitigate the issue.
So, whether it was the issue with the Legionnaires or with the lead, I mean, your department was hearing things at the very least. I mean, you were getting complaints from people you referenced earlier. And I guess, so you're working on Legionnaires and the state's not responding like you believe is appropriate. What would have been the penalty for your department to have said something publicly? I mean, what would have been, you say it's not, it wasn't, I'm paraphrasing what you're basically saying was, it wasn't our job to make that announcement or wasn't in our jurisdiction to do that announcement. But what would the penalty have been if somebody within the county health department had said basically, look, this is a public health crisis and we're going to say something? What would have been the repercussions to you for doing that?
We report to the state. All of my programs that I receive funding for are through the state of Michigan. There's an email in here from LeeAnne Schechter-Smith and she's DEQ, to Susan Bohm of Department of Health and Human Services. She and LeeAnne Schechter-Smith was the director of the Drinking Water Division. She indicated in this email that she's concerned that Genesee County Health Department is going to announce, that wasn't a deterrent for us. What we were trying to do is figure out what was going on. So it wasn't just the city. There's the idea that this was happening in just the city of Flint. It wasn't. It was happening throughout the community. Legionnaire's disease is emerging. It's more common now than it's ever been in Southeast Michigan.
But I'm not really understanding, I'm not sensing an answer to my question here.
Okay.
I understand that you were talking about doing something, or at least the state was worried that you were going to go public, but you didn't. And, at whatever reason at the time, justified or not, I'm trying to figure out, if you had decided to go forward, what would ultimately have been the cost? Whistleblower laws are out there in the private sector. What would have been the cost to you, to the department, to say, you know what, the state is wrong, and we're not going to be silent about it. We're going to do a favor to the citizens that we work for. So I'm getting that there isn't necessarily a cost except maybe to the funding for your programs. Okay, well, I look back at what Dr. Mona told us about. She had a moral obligation, and I appreciate the fact that she stood up for that moral obligation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlemen?
If I could address.
Please.
Fine.
Okay. Mona's results, if you recall, the state indicated were spliced and diced. When I read that, because I work with her, and she'd shared her information, and I was at her side when she presented it at Hurley, I knew that there was a statistically significant difference. I asked the state at that point to explain their data, which they said did not show a statistically significant difference. It didn't because their data was faulty. They included data from Flint Township because those people have Flint addresses, but they were all drinking Detroit water. So we did call out the state when we had concerns and evidence to show that they were incorrect.
Sure, and I know you mentioned that before, and I'll give you credit for that part. So I'm not trying to hang you up. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of whether or not
In
An
the-
agency such as yours, who feels that it is boxed in by its process, when do individuals such as yourselves, who are public officials, have the freedom to say, you know what, our bosses are wrong? Or to say, well, we work for the people, not for the state. That's what I was trying to get at. And if we can fix that, if that's something you can suggest to us to make fixes in the future, I'm trying to find out what stopped you from when your gut said something was wrong. Finally you came out when Dr. Mona had that. You trusted Dr. Mona. I appreciate that. But we're up here trying to find how can we make sure we have solutions in the future. How were you handcuffed? I want to know where the handcuffs are so we can make sure we take them off in the future.
I think that Legionella is an area that lacks a lot of research. Again, in looking at the numbers, at the end of the summer we had 21 cases, and I'm looking at comparing the other counties' data from the year before. We weren't anywhere near what Wayne or Detroit had. We are relying on the state because they're the experts. We admitted we were not experts in Legionella. We asked that the CDC be brought in, but they said it didn't warrant it. And to a certain extent, okay, we have half the cases of what Wayne or Detroit had. So I'm assuming they know what they're talking about. So yes, we were guilty of trusting the state.
John, I guess Representative Broom hit on the note, which is we're here to find the solutions. You both were part of going through this entire process, whether it was the Legionnaires or the lead. What can you share with this committee today that can help us to improve the process, whether it's making sure you're not stifled from going to the public, whether it's a state statute? What is it that we can learn from your experience that we can take back?
I really think that there needs to be someone in a position of oversight or an ombudsman who has that oversight role. We're dealing with 4 different agencies of state government now. The DEQ was totally focused on compliance with regulations. Public health concerns seem to be a secondary concern with them. I had an argument with a drinking water section person who was insistent that the water met EPA standards and told me that their responsibility ended at the property line, that the water had elevated lead because of the plumbing in the household. And I told her that public health does not end at the property line, that we're concerned about the water that's coming out of the taps in the homes in Flint, and that she should be too. But the challenge was that there wasn't that focus.
You're the primary health officer for the County of Genesee.
Correct.
What is your primary responsibility?
To protect the public health, which is why I issued the public health declaration on October 1st, because the agency that had jurisdiction and authority was not protecting the public health.
So the state is the only agency with authority?
This is a federal EPA law, so the EPA could have also intervened.
So there's only 2 authorities, the state and the federal government?
Over the Safe Drinking Water Act governing municipal water supplies.
Is there any other things that we can take back from what you've learned?
I would encourage that there be more transparency. Again, I think the ability to share data, to have it easily accessible, what we can do to do that will improve transparency. The ability to have data in a more just-in-time time frame. I shared with a couple of you the state-led report from 2014, which just came out last month. That's not timely. How can we respond to an emergency like what Dr. Hanna-Attisha discovered if our results come out a year later?
Mr. Henry, you have a stack of papers that you've set on the table. You indicated you have additional information. Ask the clerk if he would, is it all right if we can collect that information and make a copy? I'm assuming you don't have a copy for each of us at this point.
I do not. This is the copy that I made.
Right. Is it something available for the committee to take back that we can make available on the Flint Water Committee website for future?
Yes, yes, this is a copy for your reference.
Is there any personal or private information that needs to be retracted? To your
There's
knowledge?
not. No.
I don't want to give someone's personal information away.
No, there's nothing personal in here.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, would you? Gentlemen, I thank you for your time today. If you do see other opportunities, please share them with this committee so that we have the opportunity to make a clear difference for the people of Flint and the people of Michigan. Thank you for being here. I think we're going to do one more person, then take a short break for lunch, but we're going to call former Mayor Walling up. Mr. Mayor, or Mr. Walling, could you please come forward? Thank you for being here today. And we have oath for you.
Do you solemnly affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under perjury of penalty?
Thank you. I realize this is, again, as we said earlier, a passion for you, but the committee is here to make sure that we find solutions in the end, and so there's a lot of comments and things, and I appreciate that passion, but we want to make sure that we hear from those that have taken time to be here. We will hear from you also, and I do want to mention, if you've not filled out a yellow card, if you would please take time to fill out the card so that we can make sure that we call upon you this afternoon. And can someone, who's passing those out, or are they available in the back? They're available in the lobby, I've been told. So if you've not had that opportunity, please take that, and we'll finish up with testimony right after lunch and then go straight into public comment. So, Mr. Walling, thank you.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, Chairman and Senate Minority Leader and honorable members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to take part in the public hearing. I have a few comments, and then, of course, we'll answer all your questions. The drinking water crisis is a catastrophe for our community. It's had a devastating effect on our children, our families, our seniors, schools, neighborhoods, businesses, the entire community, as you know. I know also that Flint is a strong city. I know it will survive. With the right support, it will thrive. But Flint should have never suffered in this situation. As a father raising my own family in Flint, I'm deeply concerned for all the children and the people who have been affected. I am sorry every day that I didn't realize what was truly happening sooner. I appreciate the committee's efforts to identify what went wrong and why, so problems can be fixed, Flint can move forward, and this never happens again in our state. The public hearing today is taking place more than 5 months after the City of Flint issued the first government-led advisory, and as you just discussed, Genesee County declared a public health emergency. It's urgent that Flint's water be made 100% safe, that our victims are cared for, and that trust is restored. From my experience as mayor until November of 2005, I have a few main points for your consideration. One, Michigan's financial manager system focused too much on cutting costs without adequate safeguards and transparency. Second, the city did not have the experience and capacity in place to manage a new water source. The Flint Water Task Force report was very clear on that. The regulatory agencies also provided false assurances to us about the safety of the water and withheld information about the risks. And last, local concerns were discounted, and our agencies did not act with urgency. It's my hope that this committee's leadership will begin to heal the wounds of neglect. Your willingness to conduct a public hearing here in Flint and to allow residents to participate is a sign of hope, and it's a step in the right direction. I know in Flint we're still waiting on Governor Snyder to come and give our community the same opportunity, an invitation that I extended to him personally in January of 2015 when we were suffering from what we knew then as the TTHM crisis. There are also a number of unanswered questions that I still have even after the release of the task force report that I hope this committee will address. So there is a clear basis of understanding in place and solutions can be developed for the real problems. One unanswered question is, who was the highest state official to approve the switch to the Flint River? The state law requires emergency managers to gain approval for major financial decisions. We don't know who it was in Lansing who made the final financial decision for Flint to spend money and budget to go to the river. E.M. Kurtz signed the documents in June of 2013, but certainly not without the okay of state officials. The public also deserves to know who was the highest state official to approve the flawed water treatment design for Flint. We're all too aware now that the treatment design did not include the phosphate corrosion control, and it also did not include the activated carbon filter. The filter would have made the water easier to treat and would have averted the problems with the trihalomethanes or TTHMs. The phosphate would have protected against corrosion and leaching of lead. So one of my observations is that there's a lack of coordination among state agencies involved in EM's decisions, and that comes at the expense of residents. EMs are shielded from the natural transparency that's inherent in the Home Rule Act, and it's essential to have the right experts guiding decisions to protect the true bottom line, which is the people's public health and welfare. From day one with the river, the state regulatory agency, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, provided assurances to us that the water was safe and met the standards of the Safe Drinking Water Act. I had my own concerns. We're hearing concerns from the public, but I relied on the information provided by the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the city's public works leadership that was appointed by the managers. My family and I drank the water. I also echoed these assurances to the public, which I wholly regret. I urge the committee to push for full transparency and the public release of all water tests in all of our Michigan communities so citizens know exactly what is happening with their water at all times. Until the MDEQ admitted in October of 2015 that it had not properly applied the lead and copper rule in Flint, the agency was insistent that Flint was meeting the standards, insistent that city had to go through these 2 rounds of household tests before the corrosion control could be added. It was just after Dr. Edwards' research came out, Congressman Kildee and Michigan State Senator Ananick here raised questions to the state and the EPA. I joined them in a meeting with the regulators to get the answers. The MDEQ representative, which was Steve Bush, he insisted that the law required the testing delay and went on to say that when Flint started using the KWA water, there would have to be another round of 6-month tests to determine that optimized phosphate control could be used. The MDEQ representative said this was the law. You see, this was not a local decision, local public works or local emergency manager for that matter. It was a state mandate. For some reason, the governor's office has continued to this day to maintain there was local discretion, even in the face of the task force report, which concluded it was the state decision. I can tell you from my experience that the culture at the MDEQ is not going to be changed in a meaningful way if this is not faced honestly by the governor and his team. The city of Flint has shortcomings and mistakes were made. I mean, I know that as well as anyone. You can, walk up the street today and find challenges at City Hall. But the decision about corrosion control, it was made by the state. And it was in spite of concerns raised by city personnel and the EPA. Now, tragically, this was just, one of many opportunities that were dismissed, that could have averted the water crisis. I called for reforms and programs back to January of 2015. Again, when we were dealing with TTHMs, what we believed at the time, asking for steps to be taken in partnership with the city so we'd have safe water, tests would be publicly released, and these items are still waiting state action. I had contacted the governor directly with my plan, as I believe any mayor in a crisis situation should do. My initial request was for $20 million. We only received $2 million in grants, and now, of course, the costs are hundreds of millions. The EPA also failed to sound the alarm. When I reached out to the EPA for guidance, I also received assurances about the review process, and the true risks just were not revealed. They weren't shared. We now know that children were poisoned with lead, and we found out because local doctors like Dr. Mona analyzed health data themselves, despite resistance from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. It's true, as you've acknowledged, Flint citizens have fought so hard through this. Families, they've endured so much. And it was local citizens and doctors who forced the acknowledgement of mistakes. I commend their courage and perseverance. The support that's been provided by the county, the state, federal agencies already, it's been important, but as you know, there's far more that does have to be done. Thankfully, we worked together quickly with the legislature support to get back onto Detroit water last October. It was the fastest way to get optimized corrosion control back into Flint's system and start to limit the exposure to lead and other contamination. So I appreciate the committee's focus on solutions. From my perspective, the current plan from the governor to address the water problems, it misses a couple of key points. From what I see, there needs to be a serious plan for the community schools. You've heard about how nutrition is being delivered, and if you look at the plan, you'll see that the education section is actually about schools being delivery sites for health and other human services. But what our children need is great educational opportunities. Education is invaluable assistance that can be provided to all of our children, and I'd like to see more state leadership to work with partners to provide exceptional educational opportunities for our children and into career and college training. Second, the economic goals are woefully lacking. This has affected, this entire community in so many different ways. And the current plan is only aiming to serve 500 new job seekers over 2 years. And I want to put that in perspective for you. In January of 2006, the state's local labor market data indicates that we have a 9.9% joblessness rate here in the city of Flint. We have 3,500 unemployed workers, not counting those who are no longer participating in the labor market. So given these numbers, the state plan, the governor's plan, would move unemployment from 9.9% to 8.4% over 2 years. And that's unacceptably low goal for this community, in my opinion. I believe that Flint is a city worth investing in. Flint students and workers deserve the same opportunities as everyone in this state, as everyone in this country. A long-term plan, the comprehensive master plan, is in place. Mayor Weaver has plans for infrastructure and improvements and lead service line replacements. And I believe with the right partnerships and true public investment, Flint can be a model 21st century city. I thank each of you for your efforts to address the water crisis and also to move Flint forward, and I look forward to your questions.
Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Walling. You indicated that you wanted this committee to answer the question, who was the highest state official who approved the switch, and got a couple questions that are attempting to get to that. It was reported that you had a meeting April 19th, I believe it was, 2012, with the Genesee County Drain Commissioner, representatives from the city, including yourself and the EM, I believe, and Governor Snyder. Can you tell us what happened at that meeting in the discussion about the KWA deal?
Yes, I can. And this is a case where the decision about the community's long-term water supply, it did go all the way to the governor's desk. The emergency manager, Ed Kurtz, had sought the guidance of myself and City Council in March of 2013. I think the City Council voted 7-1 in favor of the city taking a long-term 16 MGD contract with the KWA. I expressed my support for the EM's original proposal of 18 million gallons per day. That subsequently went through, at least to my knowledge, a meeting with the deputy treasurer, which I was in, a meeting with Treasurer Dillon, and then finally this Friday evening, April 19th meeting with the governor himself that also included representatives from DWSD. The entire focus at that time was on determining the most secure, affordable water source for this community long term. And everything that was shared with myself and City Council around that decision projected that the city would continue to pay for Detroit water, would continue to have lake water in our system in the interim. So in April, as you said, the governor apparently, subsequent to that meeting, provided his okay and Treasurer Dillon's okay because it was just a few days later that EM Kurtz signed the actual water capacity contract with KWA.
So when that decision went all the way to the top, it went all the way to the top. I don't know if you would want to speculate or not on whether that was a typical practice, but certainly in that instance, that's what happened. Now, tell me what you think about this. Now, it seems to me that in that situation, the governor was approving of this new water supply system at the same time that the governor was wrestling with the solvency of the city of Detroit and the city of Detroit's largest asset, the Detroit Water and Sewer Department. So my question for you is this. If the governor was sitting on one side of the table representing the fiduciary responsibilities of the city of Detroit and the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, and the governor is also sitting on the other side of the table representing the fiduciary responsibility of the people of Flint and the water system and the provision of water to the people of Flint. Why is it that if the governor was sitting on both sides of the table, they couldn't come to a deal on continuing to buy water from DWSD?
Yeah, that's not a question I have the answer to. I mean, it was clearly before the governor. You know, emergency manager Kevin Orr was on the phone. The chair of the DWSD board, the DWSD director were both in the room for that meeting. The governor seemed a lot more interested in what was happening in the press than what was actually the details of the potential arrangements. I mean, he gave us a lecture on a couple occasions during that hour we were together about the need for everyone to be relentless and positive action, and these two communities shouldn't be saying negative statements in the press, because you may recall there was, at that time there was press about Flint leaving and Detroit's response and the EM's response. And my impression, which is all I can share from that hour with the governor on the topic, was a focus on the optics or the press part of it. He seemed to look to Dan Wyant from the DEQ and Treasurer Dillon for the details on the financial and environmental aspects of the decision.
So there's never anything stated in that meeting about the 8%, the DWSD losing 8% of their business by losing a huge customer, and what that was going to do to the financials of the other entity that he was under, had under state management. That was never mentioned.
No, it was really just focused on what could DWSD put forward to Flint for consideration, and in the written responses that I gave you the question, I gave you some detail that DWSD has a model contract that all of its customers apparently use, and it involves this distance and elevation cost. So unlike a normal utility where we're thinking we're all paying the same rate for the same electricity or natural gas, with Flint and Genesee County being customers of DWSD, we pay a rate based on the distance and the elevation from the service center. So Flint and Genesee County pay substantially more for the Detroit water than a community would in Wayne County or Oakland County. And we often discussed on our side, whether it was me with city council members or the drain commissioner or EM Kurtz, that there should be a way that Detroit could contract with this community that didn't involve those very high costs of distance and elevation. Could the KWA or Flint or Genesee County be more of a wholesale type customer? Could there be capacity leased at one of their facilities? So it was different than serving a community that's just a couple miles down the road in Wayne County. And my hope actually going into that April meeting with the governor was that because he was in that position to force a constructive, productive outcome for all of our communities, that's what that meeting would be about. But it ended up just being a kind of refereeing of what's the latest proposal from DWSD, and will Flint take the weekend to consider that before a decision was made the following week.
Okay, thank you. And that's always confused me. It seems like he's on both sides of the transaction. Why wasn't there a deal? But I understand you can only get us so close to that. What about the situation with GM making the decision to stop using this water, this corrosive water, because of the damage it was doing to their parts in their plant? When did you find out about that, and how was that communicated to you?
Yeah, I found out, I think it was a couple days after the emergency manager, this was Darnell Early at the time, and Public Works Director Howard Croft, and I was in one of the weekly meetings where key items were coming up, and it was shared that this request and concern had come in from GM, and the emergency manager, Darnell Early, was asking the DPW director to, follow up on that, to find out what the procedure was, wanting to, support General Motors. They have 4 facilities in the city, and this one was making the request. So that's when I, became aware that that had come to the city.
Was it communicated to you and to the EM and to Mr. Croft that they were no longer interested in using the water because it was corroding their parts?
Yeah, that's right. That's what I
And so was there a discussion between you and the leadership of the city about how water that was corroding metal parts might not be safe to drink?
Yeah, my point was, we need to find out a lot more about what was actually happening. So, and that's the pattern throughout all of this, is that, we have questions that are getting asked, but they never really get answered.
I guess I have one final question, which is one of the things that happened when the legislature changed the EM law in 2011 is that we gave the EMs the authority over whether or not a community that was being taken over by the state would pay their city council members or their mayor. Can you tell me about the discussions that you had with the EM around that decision? Because initially, if I understand it correctly, the EM made the decision that to save money, they were not going to pay council and the mayor, and then that changed at a certain point. Can you tell me about how and why that changed, and what is it that the EM wanted you to agree with or go along with in exchange for that change?
There were a number of changes. I believe it was a period of 3 to 4 weeks when the first emergency manager was appointed under Public Act 4, that myself and City Council had no employment relationship with the City of Flint Municipal Corporation. Then there was a job description that listed, in my case, continuing to be the point of contact on economic development, citizen complaints, leading the master planning process, and that those are in an emergency manager's orders. Those were kind of the duties that I was to undertake, and City Council had something similar. And then those were revised, I think, 2 more times, one under Darnell Early and one under EM Ambrose.
Thank you. Representative Canfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask a question about the Rowe Engineering firm's July 2011 analysis of the Flint River. Now, they indicated at that time that it would be more expensive and more challenging to treat the water. Did they specifically speak about corrosion control in that report?
Yes.
And when you heard that they were not going to put corrosion treatment in the Flint River water, did you obviously you should have heard about that? Did you hear about it at the time? When did you hear about it?
When?
There's a question.
Right. I didn't understand the lack of corrosion control until late spring of 2015. I mean, the information about what was happening or not happening throughout the city was being filtered to myself and City Council, and likewise to the public.
And I'm sure it was being filtered in other areas of our state government as well. But just to shift gears here, there were people who raised complaints early on about the water. I heard about it in June of last year down at the Capitol in a testimony that was given. I understand that you heard about it much earlier than that. And what was your response to the people, and what advice did you have to them about what's going on with the water? Because that seems like a huge bell ringing in my ears in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, our community has been dealing with this water crisis for almost 2 years. I mean, it came immediately to the mayor's office, to my office, with citizen concerns and complaints. So that's May 2014. And it was a constant process of trying to figure out, what was happening. We're talking about 2013. Got switched in April of 2013. So it was immediate, responses. And my understanding in the summer and fall of 2014 was that this was the result of this aging infrastructure and 400 main breaks that the city of Flint had. I mean, that's what was, that was my understanding. That's what was being reported. And back to your earlier question, one of the things that I certainly, fault myself for is that I didn't get a more clear, systematic understanding of the system, from top to bottom earlier. But the reality is that even when those questions were being asked to the MDEQ, it's why I reached out while we still had an emergency manager to the EPA in February of 2015, we still weren't getting all of the information. I mean, we needed the kind of independent expertise that we gained through our citizens' efforts in 2015. We needed that in place in 2013 when these decisions were being made. So, I mean, we were constantly searching to understand what was happening. Aging infrastructure, then overchlorination in TTHMs, then it was the question of corrosion and lead, at the end of the summer and early fall. So it was constantly, shifting what we knew, and that's why I made the point about, those experts who knew the risks and had identified the risks earlier, even if they didn't have all the answers themselves. Those risks needed to be put on the table. They needed to be put out in front of the public, certainly myself and city council as local elected officials, and it wasn't.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative McBroom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walling, I have a number of questions. First of all, could you elaborate for me a little bit on the organizational relationship between the water treatment plant and the Department of Public Works?
Yes. So under the structure we had in place beginning in 2012, we had a appointed director of Public Works. That was Howard Croft. He had actually previously served as in a broader capacity in a department that had been called by the first emergency manager, Infrastructure and Development. But by 2012, we had a Department of Public Works headed by Howard Croft, and he took the direct reports of the utilities administrator who managed the water treatment plant, the sewage treatment plant, and the distribution systems. Howard Croft also took the direct report of the transportation director.
Okay, and so in June of 14, the emergency manager, Darnell, issued Order 15, which made you in charge of the Department of Public Works, correct? So didn't that mean that Mr. Croft reported to you?
He did in part, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, you make a number of mentions here in your written answers to us that you were not receiving information from Mr. Croft. But
which is also correct.
But he worked for you.
He reported to me for, as you'll see in the emergency manager's order, day-to-day operations. At no time while an emergency manager was in place, and you'll have to think about the complexity of this. I had no ability to authorize a purchase for the city of Flint.
I understand.
Or personnel or a legal decision. So,
well, you wrote here that you're not specific duties that were non-financial matters under Public Act 72.
Under 72, but further, when we went back to Public Act 436, and in July 1 of 2014, when that new order gave me day-to-day supervisory responsibilities over Department of Planning and Development and the Department of Public Works, it's important to note that the purchasing decisions were not coming to my desk. I was not consulted on those, or the budget decisions. So that raises questions about what the relationship really was in total. What I did was I met with Howard Croft on a weekly basis. We went over issues like citizen complaints, the progress of the Water Service Center employees who were fixing main breaks. But I learned later that I was not given access to the most vital information. It wasn't with TTHMs until the MDEQ came to the city and Dan Wyant called a meeting because the city was going out of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, that I was even aware that those tests were being conducted and that we were going out of compliance. So there's on one hand a responsibility, and on the other hand there's information that's being parceled out before it gets to me, and I didn't figure much of this out until later.
Right, so this is what I'm trying to make sense of, because
Right.
I understand that the financial decisions were out of your hands. I've got you on that. But other than that, he worked for you. And so when it came down to TTHMs or the citizen complaints and stuff, it seems like he should have been subject to you, and if he was failing to deliver information to you, it just seems like something that shouldn't have happened, and that was not a fault of the law, but a fault of yourself for not finding that out. And so I guess, that brings me then to, kind of the same question I asked of the gentleman who were up here beforehand from the county health department, and that's, and we can take it from where we're at and add into it this email that you received from Susan Hedman on July 1st, where you had basically gotten a warning from Mr. Del Toro that it was possible that the system was contaminated with lead. And Ms. Hedman pretty much stalled you from responding to that. And so I guess why this question is the same as with the county health officials. What would the consequence have been to you if you had gone out and said, you know what, I have an interest directly to these people in my community, not to protecting Susan Hedman's butt or anything else like that?
Oh,
Please let Mr. Walling reply.
there would have been there are no consequences. We needed to have figured this water crisis out. You can pick any date. If I would have figured it out at any date before I first learned of Dr. Mona's data, then we would have been that much closer to not sitting here today.
Right.
If I would have, done more independent work on Mr. Del Toro's memo, instead of relying on the regional administrator's depiction, then we would have gotten that much closer to a solution. So that's, I fault myself for not figuring it out sooner, but it's not because I wasn't asking questions.
All right, and I appreciate, I'm not trying to, once again, box you in. I understand the question.
Just being honest about how I feel. I'm the one who has to live with my decisions.
Right, and you're admitting that, and I appreciate that, but what I'm trying to get to, the same with the previous folks, is were you handcuffed in some way that we need to remove those kind of handcuffs so it doesn't happen again? Was there somebody, is there some law, is there some practice, is there some rule that prevented you? I understand you didn't feel like you had the information, you couldn't go, I get that, but was there penalty hung over your head if you had responded?
No, I think the point I made about disclosure of tests, that's the solution to a lot of these problems, because what I found out and the community found out we had was we had a terrible TTHM problem in the summer and fall of 2014, and we had an emergency manager and a DPW director who didn't share that information. It didn't not come to me by accident. It came to me, the EM knew, the DPW director knew, And I was supposed to be in the position of overseeing those operations, but that had been excluded from my view. The way you fix that, the way you get around whether you have a good EM or a bad EM or one who, likes public notice or doesn't like public notice, is you make every publicly paid for water test available to the public. And if you do that in every city in Michigan, then, much of this crisis would have been averted if the test results that were paid for by taxpayers would have been made available to this community, including its local elected officials, then we would have averted this, months and months sooner, even with the initial mistake about corrosion control.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Annick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my colleagues asked a number of the questions I was going to ask, so I don't want to repeat them. But you mentioned before about the emergency manager's order, or it was mentioned before, that the first one allowed for citizens' complaints. And I've talked to residents, and others have, and some testified here today. But just walk us through the process that Flint residents had when they complained about water, and then what was those complaints brought to the concern of the emergency manager? Were they brought to the governor's office? And then what authority did you have to fix them? I think that's an important question to answer.
Complaints would come into all different city departments, but in particular, they come to the mayor's office. I continued to have a weekly open office where for 2 hours every Wednesday, citizens would come in, and about half of all the citizen issues that we were seeing throughout 2015, especially some 2014, were related to water. And those would all be kind of cataloged and then would be distributed to the responsible department head. The trends, the most important issues that would come up would be part of the weekly staff meetings that I was eventually a part of with department heads, even while we had an emergency manager in place. The concerns were widely known. I mean, all of the TV cameras you hear along the side were, many of them were covering the same town halls and the same, city council meetings where the issues were coming up over and over again.
Let me ask you a question then. In terms, you mentioned this a little bit about the conversations we were having before the switch to Flint River about DWSD, and you mentioned that. But what communications did you or do you know of that other people were having with the state regarding the switch to the Flint River? That specific question, and who in the administration did you talk to, and in what capacity did you talk to? Was it emails? Was it phone calls? Was it personal meetings? And can you talk a little bit about that?
This was entirely kept from myself, from city council, from the public. It was apparently inserted into the city's budget, prepared at the very end of June of 2013, after the drafts had been shared with myself and city council and the public, which did not include using the Flint River. And there was a meeting, I found out later, with the Public Works Director and MDEQ officials, Genesee County Drain officials in 2013 of late June, where the DEQ deemed the Flint River was feasible as an interim source, and very rapidly that on a plan and initial purchasing of engineering services to design the upgrades were all put together in the period of a week or two. And the rest of us found out, like we did with other decisions made by the emergency manager, when the documents were published a week or two later on the city's website. And that, every week or two, a big load of emergency manager purchases and items were made available, and that's when we found out about it. So, on one hand, you had the decision to go to KWA, which included city council meetings, financial documents being provided, a great deal of public attention. And then you had this later decision, this kind of rush to cut further costs was made within a couple weeks' time, it appears, at the end of June and early July. And that was then the 2-year budget and the plan that was put in motion. And we all found out about it, after the fact. I don't know who was involved at the state. That's one of my questions, because I think it's critical to know where did that review process break down.
I just got a couple more questions. One, obviously the governor and his members of administration for a long time were claiming that the city council's vote to join KWA was a vote to switch to the Flint River, and you might have talked about that a little bit. Could you talk about that a little bit about, and my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the emergency manager sent up a resolution for 18 gallons of water to purchase from KWA. The city council amended that, but the emergency manager just sent over what he wanted anyway. Could you talk a little bit about that process? And I got 2 more questions after that.
Well, I hope the committee recognizes, and I provided the financial projection that myself and city council saw at the time. I mean, I had the unfortunate situation of sitting next to a former emergency manager who under oath was continuing to maintain that the city council and I approved the Flint River as an interim source, and he wasn't even in Flint at the time, and he finally, under questioning, said, well, it was implicit in the vote. But the financial projection showed us paying for Detroit Water like we had for 45 years. It wasn't implicit in any of the discussions that we had. The expectation was the city of Flint needed a long-term water source. It either had to sign a new long-term contract with Detroit, or it had now the option of a contract with KWA for raw lake water. And it was not a topic of discussion. It wasn't discussed. So it's just one of those, I just don't see how someone, especially who wasn't even in the city at the time, would so strongly maintain that it was implicit in the decision, because it just wasn't. I was a part of all of that. Those city council meetings were public.
Thank you. And if I have time, a couple more questions. And obviously, the other one was about the emergency manager order that Representative McBroom talked about, and I'm obviously not here to absolve the failings of the city government or the state or the EPA. We have responsibility primarily over the response from the state government. It's important to know the mistakes that were made at all levels, but we have a much more direct impact on the response from the state than we do on obviously the other levels. But the governor's spokesman lately has been shopping around that order, specific order that Representative McBroom was talking about, to absolve sort of the governor and the state of the blame. But the task force response was, though it may be technically true that all levels of government failed, the state's responsibility should not be deflected. The causes of the crisis lie primarily at the feet of the state by virtue of its agencies' failures and its appointed emergency managers' misjudgments. That was from the task force. But with that order where they gave you day-to-day responsibilities, and I think Representative McBroom talked about the finances, but were you empowered to remove any one of the responsibilities? Were you empowered to fire the public works director?
No, I had, all I could do, which I did, was, take my concerns about the public works director's, performance and qualifications to the emergency manager, and those weren't unknown to him. I mean, he now speaking of Darnell Early, who was in place during this time, he was well aware of my positions on those issues, and other staff. I had a very kind of clear approach to senior appointees. I wanted people who had experience doing the job that they were going to be placed in, whether it's chief of police, chief planning officer, certainly public works director. And the public works director did not fit that criteria. He had been appointed by the first emergency manager. So my concerns were well known to the other staff, all of the emergency managers, but it wasn't my authority to make any changes to those personnel, and frankly, I didn't speak publicly about those concerns. I saw those as internal, and I never wanted to, undercut the work of the city of Flint when that authority did actually, under law, rest with another individual. That was a decision made by the governor in the state to take that authority from myself and city council and place it in another individual.
You sort of answered it, and because my last question was going to be, if there weren't any obstacles, if there weren't any retribution, then just why didn't it go public? You kind of answered it, but I think the question of why you didn't take those concerns public was something I wanted to ask.
Yeah, and not in a specific way. I mean, if you look at the letter that I sent to the governor in January of 2015, I specifically call out the need for the city of Flint to have experienced capacity within the Department of Public Works. So, I didn't name names because I wasn't the person who had the ability to perform that personnel review or function. But my concern was there, and I believed, and that was without knowing about corrosion control and lead, that we desperately needed, a different approach in the city of Flint. And again, if I had been empowered, if I had the actual authority to act, making a comment at a city council meeting or to a reporter, that doesn't change what those with the legal authority do or don't do when it comes to their own governing decisions.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. Number one, your opening remarks appeared were prepared. Is it possible we could have the copy of that?
Yes. Yes, Chairman.
Thank you. And did I understand correctly, in the period 2014, you just didn't have the knowledge of corrosion control at that point?
I did not.
Okay. And so the report that you commissioned in 2011 from Rowe that included the statement to include corrosion control, you had not had the opportunity to read that report, or?
No, I meant to say that I wasn't aware that the city was not using the optimized corrosion control.
And you had mentioned earlier that you were having I believe it was weekly meetings on Wednesday mornings for individuals of the residents to come and speak with you. We've heard testimony throughout the morning regarding no one was listening to anyone. If Mrs. Walters brought forward information, it was not brought to you. The county says that the city didn't share, the city says the county didn't share, the city and the county say the state just blew it off, gave a different excuse. How do we fix that?
A big part of what I see in retrospect is that we didn't have that inherent kind of check and balance with the public that you have in normal home rule situations. As I look back and try to figure out how I got the information I got at different points, under this emergency manager about this problem or that problem, it's so fragmented. Like I said, I had every expectation when I was sitting down with the DPW director after the order was in place for that person, to report to me for day-to-day responsibilities. I had every expectation that I was getting the same kind of critical information to make decisions that I would get if the chief of police were providing me with a report. If you have a spike in burglaries, then you bring that up the chain of command. And there was, in this case, just a lot of information that was being parceled out and withheld, and that was compounded by the fact that there wasn't the regular public disclosure and public discussions that take place, during your normal, 5-hour City of Flint city council meeting.
I apologize. I want to go back to the meetings you were having on Wednesdays where you were hearing the residents. Was someone taking notes and following up with you to make sure that the residents' requests and/or concerns were followed up on?
Yeah, that was my responsibility. I didn't have previously, before the emergency managers, I had a citizen services director who was responsible for that function. That position was eliminated by the emergency manager, so I took it upon myself to continue to have those meetings, to take notes, to follow up with department heads. As Ms. Leanne Walters indicated, there was a lot of back and forth with the city. I don't think we ever addressed that the way we should have, but I know at the time I was getting, the same reports like she mentioned. Okay, the city's prepared to replace the service line. It's stuck up in the legal department. I would try to find out, what's actually happening. Well, why is this a holdup? Why can't we just move forward with this? But anytime I encountered, a financial matter, a legal matter, a personnel matter, then I had to figure out how to kind of take that to the emergency manager if it needed that, if it needed his support to actually move something forward.
When she brought it to, I'm assuming you, the third week, and you followed up with legal saying, why isn't this done? What was the response?
Well, as she said, the department was just insistent on this, for a period of time, on the need for this waiver before action would be taken. I didn't support that. I felt like this was clearly a case where we had a serious problem, and the city needed to take responsibility for addressing it. But there was a different approach under the emergency managers. The way I was able to address citizen concerns, and you can like it or not like it, but we would try to deal with those with issues as much as we could without having to go through damage claim forms, and we tried to just be responsive to citizens in the areas where we could with limited means. But that approach changed. It was consistent under all the emergency managers, that it became a much more kind of legalized process of fill out a damage claim, consult with legal. It was a different approach.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate you taking time. If you would leave that with us, I'd appreciate it.
I sure will.
Thank you. We're going to, thank you. We're going to take about a 20-minute break and go at ease. We will give at least a 5-minute notice before we start again, so that the public has the opportunity to come back in here. We have just about 3 more testimonies to take, and then we will be opening up to the public comment. And I thank you and appreciate your patience. Thank you. Thank you. We'll stand at ease.